In a distant corner of the universe, where stars whisper ancient secrets and planets move to the rhythm of eternity, lies a text that defies the limits of time and space. This work, The Divine Law by Allan Kardec, is more than just words written in celestial ink. It is a voyage into the profound mysteries of the human soul and its connection to the cosmos. Picture an orbit where wisdom is woven from threads of light, where enlightened spirits share ancient truths with those who listen with open hearts. Allan Kardec, a fearless explorer of the spiritual realm, invites us to unravel the universe's secrets through this text, which transcends the boundary between the visible and the unseen. From the physical realms to the domains of spirits, each word reverberates like an echo of divine wisdom, guiding us on a journey of self-discovery and spiritual elevation. Prepare to uncover the universal principles that govern life in all its forms, and to explore the story of how an ordinary man became a beacon of light in the spiritual firmament. With voice as your guide and soul as your compass, dive into the Divine Law, where each chapter reveals profound truths and each paragraph unlocks doors to a deeper understanding of our divine purpose. Let these words resonate within you, a reminder that in the search for truth, we find the path to infinity. Moral laws, divine or natural laws, characteristics of natural law, source and knowledge of natural law, good and evil. Division of natural law, characteristics of natural law. What is meant by natural law? Natural law is the law of God. It is the only true law for human happiness, telling us what we should or should not do, and one is unhappy only because they turn away from it. Is the law of God eternal? It is eternal and immutable, just as God himself. Could God have prescribed to men at one time what he would have forbidden at another? God cannot be wrong. It is humans who are forced to change their laws because they are imperfect. But God's laws are perfect. The harmony that regulates the material and moral universes rests on the laws that God has established since eternity. What do divine laws encompass? They concern more than moral conduct. All natural laws are divine laws, since God is the author of all things. The scientist studies the laws of matter. The good person studies those of the soul and practices them. Can a person delve into both? Yes, but one lifetime is not enough. Indeed, what are a few years to acquire everything that constitutes a perfect being? If we only consider the distance between the savage and the civilized man, the longest possible lifetime is insufficient, and even more so when it is cut short, as it is for many people. Among divine laws, some regulate the movement and relationships of raw matter. These are the physical laws, and their study falls within the domain of science. Others specifically refer to the person in themselves and in their relationships with God and their fellow beings. They include the rules of bodily life as well as those of spiritual life. These are the moral laws. Are divine laws the same for all worlds? Reason says that they must be adapted to the nature of each world and proportioned to the degree of advancement of the beings who inhabit them. Knowledge of natural law. Has God given all humans the means to know his law? All can know it, but not everyone understands it. Those who understand it best are the good people and those who seek it. However, all will understand it one day, for progress is necessary. The justice of the various incarnations of man is a consequence of this principle, as in each new existence their intelligence is more developed, and they better understand what is good and what is bad. If everything were to be achieved in a single existence, what would be the fate of so many millions who die each day in the stupor of savagery or in the darkness of ignorance without having had the opportunity to enlighten themselves? Does the soul, before its union with the body, understand the law of God better than after its incarnation? It understands it according to the degree of perfection it has reached, and retains an intuitive memory of it after its union with the body, but the bad instincts of man often cause it to forget. Where is the law of God written? In the conscience. Since man carries the law of God in his conscience, what need would there be to reveal it to him? He had forgotten and despised it. God wanted it to be reminded to him. Did God give certain men the mission to reveal his law? Yes, certainly. At all times, men have received this mission. These are superior spirits incarnated to advance humanity. Have those who claim to instruct men in the law of God sometimes been mistaken and led them astray with false principles? Those who were not inspired by God and who, out of ambition, assumed a mission they did not have, certainly led people astray. However, since they were ultimately men of genius, amidst the errors they taught, we often find great virtues. What is the nature of the true prophet? The true prophet is a good man, inspired by God. He can be recognized by his words and actions. God cannot use the mouth of a liar to teach the truth. What is the most perfect prototype that God has given to man as a guide and model? Look at Jesus. Jesus is the type of moral perfection to which humanity can aspire on earth. God offers him to us as the most perfect model. And the doctrine he taught is the purest expression of his law, for he was animated by the divine Spirit and was the purest being ever to appear on earth. If some of those who claim to instruct man in the law of God have sometimes led him astray with false principles, it is because they allowed themselves to be dominated by overly earthly feelings and confused the laws that govern the conditions of the soul's life with those that govern the life of the body. Many have given as divine laws what were merely human laws created to serve passions and dominate men. Have divine and natural laws only been revealed to men by Jesus, and before him were they only known by intuition? Did we not say that they are written everywhere? All men who have meditated on wisdom have been able to understand and teach them. Since the earliest centuries, their teachings, though incomplete, have prepared the ground to receive the seed. Given that divine laws are written in the book of nature, man has been able to know them when he has sought them. That is why the precepts they embody have been proclaimed since immemorial times by good men, and that is also why we find their elements in the moral doctrine of all peoples emerging from barbarism, though incomplete or altered by ignorance and superstition. Since Jesus taught the true laws of God, what is the purpose of the teaching given by the spirits? Do they have something more to teach us? Jesus' words were often allegorical and in parables, as he spoke according to the times and places. Now the truth must be intelligible to all. We must explain and develop these laws, for very few people understand them, and even fewer practice them. Our mission is to open the eyes and ears to confound the proud and unmask the hypocrites, those who affect the appearance of virtue and religion, to hide their depravity. The teachings of the spirits must be clear and unequivocal, so that no one can claim ignorance, and that everyone can judge and appreciate them with their reason. We are tasked with preparing the reign of good announced by Jesus. Therefore, no one should interpret the law of God according to their own passions, or distort the meaning of a law that is all love and charity. Why has truth not always been accessible to everyone? Everything must happen in its own time. Truth is like light. One must gradually get used to it, or it dazzles. Never before has God allowed man to receive such complete and instructive communications as those given today. As you know, in antiquity, some individuals possessed what they considered sacred knowledge, which they kept mysterious from the profane. According to what you know of the laws governing these phenomena, you should understand that they only received a few scattered truths amidst a largely symbolic and ambiguous whole. However, there is no ancient philosophical system, tradition, or religion that should be neglected by the cultivated man, for everything contains the germ of great truths. Although they seem contradictory among themselves, scattered as they are among unfounded accessories, they are very easy to coordinate thanks to the key that Spiritism gives us, making sense of things that until now might have seemed meaningless and whose reality is now irrefutably demonstrated. Therefore, do not neglect to draw study subjects from these materials, as they are very rich and can powerfully contribute to your education. Good and evil. What is the definition of morality? Morality is the rule of proper conduct, that is, the distinction between good and evil. It is based on the observation of God's law. Man behaves well when he acts for the good of all, as then he is following God's law. How can we distinguish between good and evil? Good is everything that conforms to God's law, and evil is everything that deviates from it. Thus, doing good means conforming to God's law. Doing evil means transgressing that same law. Does man have the means to distinguish what is good from what is evil? Yes, when he believes in God and wants to know, for God has given him the understanding to discern one from the other. Can man, subject to error, be mistaken in his appreciation of good and evil and believe he is doing good when in reality he is doing evil? Jesus said to him, "See what you would want others to do or not do to you, that's all. You will not be mistaken." Can the rule of good and evil, which we might call reciprocity or solidarity, be applied to a man's personal conduct toward himself? He finds in natural law the rule of this conduct and a reliable guide. When you eat too much, it harms you because it is God who provides the measure of what you need. When you exceed this measure, you are punished. It is the same for everything. Natural law sets the limit of man's needs. When he exceeds it, he is punished by suffering. If man always listened to this voice that says enough, he would avoid most of the ills he blames on nature. Why is evil present in the nature of things? I am speaking of moral evil. Could God not have created humanity under better conditions? We have already said that spirits were created simple and ignorant. God leaves man the choice of his path, and it is worse for him if he chooses the wrong one. His pilgrimage will be longer. If there were no mountains, man would not understand that he can ascend and descend, and if there were no rocks, he would not understand that there are hard bodies. It is necessary for the spirit to gain experience, and for that it must know good and evil. This is why there is a union of spirit and body. Do different social positions create new needs that are not the same for all men? Does natural law therefore not seem to be a uniform standard? These different positions are in nature and according to the law of progress. This does not prevent the unity of natural law that applies to all. The conditions of human existence change according to time and place, giving rise to different needs and social positions adapted to these needs. Since this diversity is in the order of things, it is in accordance with the law of God, and this law is no less a law because it fundamentally corresponds to the reason of distinguishing real needs from fictitious or conventional ones. Are good and evil absolute for all men? The law of God is the same for all, but evil mostly depends on the willingness to follow it. Good is always good, and evil is always evil, regardless of a man's position. The difference lies in the degree of responsibility. Is the savage who succumbs to his instincts by feeding on human flesh guilty? I said that evil depends on the will. Well, a man is more guilty as he knows what he is doing. Circumstances give good and evil a relative gravity. Man often commits faults that, although resulting from the position society has placed him in, are still reprehensible. But responsibility is proportional to the means he has to understand good and evil. Thus, the enlightened man who commits a simple injustice is more guilty in the eyes of God than the ignorant savage who succumbs to his instincts. Evil sometimes seems to be a consequence of the force of things, as in some cases the necessity to even destroy one's neighbor. Can we then say there is a breach of God's law? It is not evil even if it is necessary, but this necessity disappears as the soul becomes purer over successive existences, and then the man is all the more guilty when he commits it because he understands it better. Is not the evil we commit often the result of the position that other men have created for us? In this case, who are the most guilty? Evil falls back on the one who causes it. Thus, the man who is led to evil by the position imposed on him by his peers is less guilty than those who are the cause of it, for each will bear the penalty not only for the evil he has done, but also for that which he has caused. Are we as guilty if we do not do evil but benefit from the evil done by another? It is as if we committed it. Benefiting from it means participating in it. Perhaps one would not have committed the act, but if finding it done, one takes advantage of it. Then the fault is as if one had done it oneself, if one could or dared to do so. Is the desire for evil as condemnable as the evil itself? It is consistent. There is virtue in voluntarily resisting the evil one desires, especially when one has the opportunity to satisfy that desire. If only the opportunity is missing, one is guilty. Is it enough not to do evil to please God and secure one's future position? No, it is necessary to do good to the best of one's ability, for everyone will be held accountable for all the evil they have done and the good they have not done. Are there people who, due to their position, do not have the opportunity to do good? There is no one who cannot do good. Only the selfish never finds the opportunity. It is enough to be in relation with other people to find the chance to do good, and every day of life offers this to anyone who is not blinded by selfishness. For doing good is not only being charitable, but being useful to the extent of one's power whenever one's help is needed. Is the environment in which some men find themselves not the main source of many vices and crimes? Yes, but it remains a trial chosen by the Spirit in a state of freedom. The Spirit wanted to expose itself to temptation to earn resistance. When a man is in some way immersed in an atmosphere of vice, does evil not become an almost irresistible impulse for him? It is not irresistible, for amidst this atmosphere of vice, one can sometimes find great virtues. These are spirits that have had the strength to resist, and who also have the mission of exerting a good influence on their peers. Is the merit of the good one does subject to certain conditions, meaning are there different degrees of merit in doing good? The merit of doing good lies in the difficulty. There is no merit in doing good without difficulty, or when it costs nothing. God values more the poor person who shares their only piece of bread than the rich person who gives only what is left. Jesus said this about the widow's mite. Division of natural law. Is all of God's law contained in the maxim of loving one's neighbor, as taught by Jesus? Certainly, this maxim encompasses all duties between men, but its application must be demonstrated. Otherwise, people will neglect it as they do today. Moreover, natural law includes all the circumstances of life, and this maxim is just a part of it. Men need precise rules. General and vague precepts leave too many doors open to interpretation. What do they think about the division of natural law into 10 parts, including laws of worship, labor, reproduction, conservation, destruction, society, progress, equality, freedom, and finally, laws of justice, love, and charity? This division of God's law into 10 parts is that of Moses and can encompass all the circumstances of life, which is essential. Thus it can be followed without anything missing, just like all other classification systems that depend on the viewpoint from which something is considered. The last law is the most important, as it is through it that man can progress the most in spiritual life, as it summarizes all others, the law of worship. What is worship? Is it the elevation of the spirit towards God through adoration? It brings one's soul closer to Him. Is adoration the result of an innate feeling or the product of teaching? It is an innate feeling, just like the sense of divinity. The awareness of one's weakness leads man to bow before the one who can protect him. Have there been peoples without a sense of adoration? No, for there have never been atheistic peoples. All understand that there is a supreme being above them. Can we consider that worship has its origin in natural law? Yes, because it is the result of an innate feeling in man. That is why it is found among all peoples, although in different forms. Does worship need external manifestations? True adoration is in the heart, in all your actions. Always remember that a master is watching you. Is external worship useful? Yes, if it is not a vain pretense. It is always useful to set a good example for those who perform it merely out of pretense and self-interest, whose behavior contradicts their apparent piety. Such people give a worse than good example and do more harm than they realize. Does God prefer those who worship Him in this or that way? God prefers those who worship Him with all their heart, sincerely, by doing good and avoiding evil, rather than those who believe they honor Him with ceremonies that do not make them better towards their fellow beings. All men are brothers and children of God. He calls all those who follow His laws, whatever their form. He who only has the appearance of piety is a hypocrite. He for whom worship is merely affected and in contradiction with his behavior gives a bad example. He who claims to worship Christ and is proud, envious, jealous, harsh, and relentless towards others, or greedy for worldly goods. I tell you that religion is only on his lips and not in his heart. God, who sees all, will judge. He who knows is 100 times more guilty of the evil he does than the ignorant savage of the desert, and he will be treated accordingly on the day of judgment. If a blind person hits you, you forgive them. If they see clearly, you complain and are right. Do not ask, therefore, if there is a more appropriate form of worship, as it would be asking if it is more pleasing to God to be worshipped in one language rather than another. Again, I tell you, hymns reach God only through the door of the heart. Is it wrong to practice a religion to which one deeply believes in their soul when it is done out of human respect and to scandalize those who think differently? Yes, because in this, as in many other things, intention is the key. He who only seeks to respect the beliefs of others does no harm. He does better than one who ridicules them, as this would show a lack of charity. But he who practices for personal gain and ambition is despicable in the eyes of God and men. God cannot take pleasure in those who humble themselves before him only in appearance to gain the approval of men. Is communal worship preferable to individual worship? Men united by a communion of thoughts and feelings have more power to call upon good spirits, just as those who gather to worship God. However, do not think that individual worship is less valuable, as each person can worship God by thinking of him alone in a contemplative life. Do those who dedicate themselves to a contemplative life without doing harm and thinking only of God have merit in his eyes? No, because if they do no harm, they do no good and are useless. Moreover, not doing good is already a form of harm. God wants us to think of him, but he does not want us to think of him alone, as he has entrusted man with duties to fulfill on earth. He who consumes himself in meditation and contemplation accomplishes nothing meritorious in the eyes of God, as his life is selfish and useless for humanity, and God will call him to account for the good he did not do. Is prayer pleasing to God? Prayer is always pleasing to God when it is dictated by the heart, as intention is what matters to him. Heartfelt prayer is preferable to prayer that is read, no matter how beautiful, if it is read more with the lips than with the spirit. Prayer is pleasing to God when it is made with faith, fervor, and sincerity, but do not think he is moved by the prayer of the vain, proud, and selfish man. It will only have effect if it is an act of sincere repentance and true humility on his part. What is the general nature of prayer? Prayer is an act of worship. To pray to God is to think of him, to draw nearer to him, to enter into communication with him. Through prayer, we can aim for three things: to praise, to ask, and to thank. Does prayer make a person better? Yes, for one who prays with fervor and trust is stronger against the temptations of evil, and God sends him good spirits to help. This is a help that is never denied when sincerely requested. How is it that some people who pray a lot still have very bad character, are jealous, envious, vindictive, and lack kindness and indulgence, sometimes even being vicious? The main thing is not to pray a lot, but to pray well. These people believe that all merit lies in the length of the prayer. If they ignore their own faults, the prayer becomes for them an activity, a schedule, but not a self-examination. It is not the remedy for what is ineffective, it is how it is used. Can we pray usefully to God for the forgiveness of our sins? God can discern good and evil. Prayer does not obscure faults. He who asks God for forgiveness of his sins only obtains it if he changes his conduct. Good deeds are the best prayer, for actions are worth more than words. Can we pray usefully for others? The spirit of the one who prays acts through their will to do good. Through prayer, they attract good spirits who join in the good they wish to do. We possess within ourselves, through thought and will, a power of action that extends well beyond the limits of our physical sphere. Praying for others is an act of this will. If it is fervent and sincere, it can call upon good spirits to suggest good thoughts and give the strength needed body and soul. But here too, heartfelt prayer is everything. Prayer of the lips is nothing. Can our prayers for ourselves change the nature of our trials and alter their course? Your trials are in the hands of God, and some must be endured to the end. But God always takes resignation into account. Prayer calls forth good spirits that give you the strength to endure them with courage and make them less harsh. As we have said, prayer is never useless when well done, as it gives strength, and that is already a great result. Help yourself and heaven will help you, you know that. Moreover, God cannot change the order of nature to suit each individual, as what is a great evil from the petty and fleeting perspective of your life is often a great good in the general order of the universe. Furthermore, how many harms does man inflict upon himself through his myopia or faults for which he is punished? However, just requests are often granted more often than you think. You may believe that God has not listened to you because he did not perform a miracle, while he assists you through means so natural that they seem to be the result of chance or the force of things. Often, very often, he gives you the necessary thought to get you out of trouble. Is it useful to pray for the dead and for suffering spirits, and if so, how can our prayers bring them relief and mitigate their suffering? Do they have the power to soften God's justice? Prayer cannot change God's plans, but the soul for which we pray is relieved because it is a testimony of the interest we show. The unfortunate always finds relief when encountering charitable souls who empathize with their pain. On the other hand, through prayer, one awakens in oneself the repentance and desire to do what is necessary to be happy. In this sense, one's pain can be diminished. With its goodwill, this desire for improvement stirred by prayer attracts better spirits to the suffering spirits who come to enlighten, console, and give hope. Jesus prayed for the lost sheep, showing that you would be at fault for not doing so for those in greater need. What is to be thought of the opinion that rejects praying for the dead, arguing that it is not prescribed in the gospel? Christ told men to love one another. This recommendation includes using all possible means to show mutual affection without going into details on how to achieve this goal. Although nothing can divert the Creator from the application of justice, which is the model for all actions of the Spirit, it is equally true that the prayer you address to those for whom you have affection is a testament of remembrance for them, which can only help alleviate their suffering and console them once they show even the slightest repentance. And it is only then that they are helped. But never ignore that a compassionate soul has cared for them, and remain with the sweet thought that your intercession has been useful to them. The result is necessarily a feeling of gratitude and affection from them towards the one who has given them this proof of attachment and piety. The love that Christ recommended to men has only increased among them, as they have all obeyed the law of love and unity of all beings, the objective and end of the divine spirit that must achieve unity. Can we pray to spirits? We can pray to good spirits because they are the messengers of God and executors of His will, but their power is proportional to their superiority, and this superiority is always in the hands of the Master of all things, without whose authorization nothing is done. Thus, prayers addressed to them are only effective if they are received by God. Why is polytheism one of the oldest and most widespread beliefs? If it is false, the idea of a single God can only be the result of the development of human ideas, unable in its ignorance to conceive of an immaterial being without a defined form acting on matter. Humans had attributed to God the attributes of physical nature. Thus a form and a figure were ascribed, and since then everything that seemed to exceed the proportions of vulgar intelligence was considered a deity. Everything that was not understood was thought to be the work of a supernatural power, and it was only a very short step to believing in as many distinct powers as there were effects observed. But at all times, there have been enlightened men who understood the impossibility for this multitude of powers to govern the world without a superior direction, and they elevated their thought towards a single God. Since spiritual phenomena have occurred at all times and were known since the early ages of the world, they could not have led to the belief in a plurality of gods. Undoubtedly, as men called everything supernatural God, spirits were gods to them. That is why when a person distinguished himself among others by his actions, genius, or by an occult power not understood by the common people, he became a god for them and was worshipped after his death. The word God had a very broad meaning among the ancients. It was not like today a personification of the master of nature, but a generic qualification given to any being outside the conditions of humanity. Now spiritual manifestations having revealed to them the existence of incorporeal beings acting as a force of nature, they called them gods, just as we call spirits. It is a simple question of words, with the difference that in their ignorance maintained deliberately by those who had an interest in it, they erected very lucrative temples and altars to them, while for us they are only simple creatures like us, more or less perfect, who have shed their earthly envelope. If we study carefully the different attributes of pagan deities, we will easily recognize in them all the attributes of our spirits, at all levels of the spiritist scale, their physical state in the higher worlds. or the properties of the perispirit and the role they play in earthly affairs. Christianity, coming to illuminate the world with its divine light, could not destroy something that is in nature, but it made worship transfer to the one to whom it belongs. As for the spirits, their memory has been perpetuated under different names according to different peoples, and their manifestations, which have never ceased, have been interpreted in various ways and often exploited under the influence of mystery. While religion saw miraculous phenomena in them, skeptics saw mere tricks. Today, thanks to more serious studies conducted in the light of day, Spiritism, freed from the superstitious ideas that obscured it for centuries, reveals to us one of the greatest and most sublime principles of nature: sacrifices. The practice of human sacrifice dates back to the earliest times. How could man believe that such acts could please God? First, because he did not understand God as a source of goodness. Among primitive peoples, matter outweighed spirit, and they indulged in brutal instincts resulting in general cruelty, as their moral sense was not fully developed. Secondly, primitive man naturally believed that a living creature was much more valuable to God than a material body. This led them to sacrifice animals first, and then humans, thinking that the value of the sacrifice was proportional to the importance of the victim in material life. Just as you always choose the most precious gift when you want to show your attachment and regard for someone, so it was with ignorant men toward God. Thus, animal sacrifices would have preceded human sacrifices, which is not questioned according to this explanation. Human sacrifices did not originate from a sense of cruelty, but from a mistaken idea of pleasing God, as seen with Abraham and later with those who abused by sacrificing even their particular enemies. However, God has never demanded sacrifices, whether of animals or humans, as one cannot honor God through the unnecessary destruction of his own creatures. Have human sacrifices performed with pious intention ever been pleasing to God? No, never. God judges the intention. Men, in their ignorance, might believe that they were performing a laudable act by sacrificing one of their fellows, but for God only the thought mattered, not the act itself. As men evolved, they were expected to recognize their error and condemn these sacrifices, which did not align with the conception of enlightened spirits. I say enlightened because at that time the spirits were still veiled by matter, but through their free will they could glimpse their origin and purpose. Many already intuitively understood the evil they were doing, but that did not prevent them from satisfying their passions. What should we think of the so-called holy wars, this sentiment that drives fanatical peoples to exterminate as many as possible of those who do not share their beliefs in order to please God? It seems to have the same source as that which once excited them to sacrifice their fellows. They are driven by malevolent spirits, and by waging war against their fellow men, they go against the will of God, who says that one must love one's neighbor as oneself. Since all religions, or rather all peoples, worship the same God, whether he is called by one name or another, why undertake an extermination war against them simply because their religion is different or has not yet reached the progress of enlightened peoples? Peoples are excusable for not believing in the word of one who was animated by the Spirit of God and sent by him, especially when they have not seen him nor witnessed his deeds. And how can we expect them to believe in this word of peace when it is presented to them with a sword in hand? They must enlighten themselves, and we must try to make them know our doctrine through persuasion and gentleness, not by force and blood. Many of you do not believe in the communications we have with certain mortals because you want strangers to believe in your word, while your actions contradict the doctrine you preach. Are offerings of the fruits of the earth to God more worthy in his eyes than the sacrifice of animals? I have already answered you by saying that God judges the intention, and the act itself is of little importance to him. Obviously, it is more pleasing to God to offer him the fruits of the earth rather than the blood of victims, as I have told you before and repeat today. A prayer from the heart is 100 times more pleasing to God than any offering you could make. I repeat that it is the intention that counts, and the act is nothing. Would there be a way to make these offerings more pleasing to God by dedicating them to relieving those who lack the necessities of life? In this case, the sacrifice of animals for a useful purpose would not be praiseworthy. while it was abusive when it served no purpose or only benefited those who had nothing. Would it not be truly pious to dedicate to the poor the first fruits of the goods that God grants us on earth? God always blesses those who do good. Relieving the poor and the afflicted is the best way to honor him. I am not saying that God disapproves of the ceremonies you perform to honor him, but there is much money that could be used more effectively. God loves simplicity in all things. A person who focuses on outward appearances rather than the heart is a narrow-minded person. Judge whether God should focus on form more than on substance. Is the necessity of work a law of nature? Work is indeed a law of nature, therefore it must be a necessity. Civilization compels man to work more because it increases his needs and pleasures. Work should be understood not only as material occupations, but also as spiritual ones. The body works just as the mind does. Any useful occupation is work. Why is work imposed on man? It is a consequence of his bodily nature, a form of atonement, and at the same time, a means of perfecting his intelligence. Without work, man would remain in the infancy of his intelligence. That is why he owes his food, security, and well-being to his work and activity. To those who are physically too weak, God has given intelligence to compensate, but it is still work. While nature satisfies all the needs of animals, they work just as you do. But their work, like their intelligence, is limited to preserving their own existence. It does not lead them to progress, while man has a dual objective: the preservation of the body and the development of thought, which elevates him above himself. When I say that animal work is limited to the preservation of their own existence, I am referring to the goal they set for themselves in working. However, without knowing it, they are agents supporting the Creator's plans, and their work does not diminish the ultimate purpose of nature, even if the immediate result is often undiscovered. Even in the most advanced worlds, man is subjected to the same necessity of work. The nature of work is relative to the nature of needs. The fewer material needs there are, the less work is needed. But do not think that man remains idle and useless. Idleness would be a torment rather than an advantage. A man who possesses enough goods to ensure his existence is perhaps freed from the law of material work, but not from the obligation to be useful according to his means to perfect his intelligence or that of others, which is also work. If a man to whom God has granted enough to ensure his existence is not obliged to earn his living by the sweat of his brow, his obligation to be useful to his fellow beings is even greater, as he has more means to contribute to the common good thanks to the portion that was given to him in advance. There are no men who cannot work in any way, and whose existence is useless. God is just and only condemns those whose existence is voluntarily useless because they live at the expense of others' work. He wants everyone to be useful according to their capabilities. The law of nature requires that children work for their parents, just as parents must work for their children. That is why God created filial and paternal love, a natural sentiment that allows family members to help each other. This is often overlooked in modern society. Since rest is a necessity after work, though it is not a law of nature, rest serves to restore the body's strength and is also necessary to give a bit more freedom to intelligence so that it can rise above matter. What is the limit of work? It is the limit of strength. Additionally, God leaves man his freedom. What should we think of those who abuse their authority to impose excessive work on their subordinates? It is one of the most perverse actions. Anyone with the power to command is responsible for the excess work imposed on their subordinates, as it transgresses the law of God. Does man have the right to rest in old age? Yes, for he is only obliged according to his strength. But what recourse does an old person have who needs to work to live and cannot do so? The strong must work for the weak. In the absence of family, society must take its place. This is the law of charity. It is not enough to tell a person that they must work. Those who rely on their work for existence must also find something to do, and this is not always the case. When the suspension of work becomes general, it takes on the proportions of a scourge, like famine. Economic science seeks the remedy in the balance between production and consumption, but this balance, even if possible, will always be intermittent. During these intervals, the worker must live. There is an element that has not been sufficiently considered. without which economic science is merely a theory. It is education. Not intellectual education, but moral education. Not that of books, but that which involves shaping character and instilling habits. For education is the sum of acquired habits. When we think of the mass of individuals thrown every day into the torrent of population, without principles, without restraint, left to their own instincts, is the reproduction of living beings a law of nature? It is evident, without reproduction, the material world would perish. If the population continues to grow as we see, it will reach a point where it will be luxuriant on the earth. God always provides and maintains balance. He does nothing in vain. Man who sees only a corner of nature's picture cannot judge the harmony of the whole. Currently, there are human races that are visibly declining. There will come a time when they will have disappeared from the earth, that is certain, but others will have taken their place, just as others will one day take yours. Are modern humans a new creation, or the perfected descendants of primitive beings? They are the same spirits who have returned to perfect themselves in new bodies, but are still far from perfection. Thus, the current human race, with its expansion to cover the entire earth and replace the extinct races, will have its own decline and disappearance. Other, more perfect races will replace them, descending from the current race, just as civilized men of today descend from the crude and wild beings of primitive times. From a purely physical perspective, are the bodies of the current race a special creation, or do they come from primitive bodies through reproduction? The origin of races is lost in the mists of time, but all belong to the great human family. Regardless of each race's primitive stock, they have been able to combine to produce new types. What is the physical, distinctive, and dominant characteristic of primitive races? The development of brute strength at the expense of intellectual strength. Now it is the opposite. Man achieves more through intelligence than through bodily strength, and yet he accomplishes 100 times more because he has learned to harness the forces of nature, something animals do not do. Is the improvement of animal and plant races by science contrary to the law of nature? It would be more in line with this law to let things follow their natural course. Everything should be done to achieve perfection, and man himself is an instrument used by God to achieve his ends. Since perfection is the goal towards which nature aims, it aligns with its views by encouraging this perfection. However, man, in his efforts to improve races, often does so purely out of personal sentiment and has no other goal than to increase his own pleasure. This does not diminish their merit. It does not matter that their merit may be negligible as long as they progress. It is up to him to make his work meritorious through intention. Moreover, this work exercises and develops his intelligence, and it is in this aspect that he benefits the most. Are human laws and customs that aim to or result in preventing reproduction contrary to the law of nature? Anything that hinders the progress of nature is contrary to the general law. However, there are species of living beings, animals and plants, for whom indefinite reproduction would be harmful to other species, including man himself, who would soon be affected. It is reprehensible to allow such proliferation. God has given man power over all living beings, which he must use for good but not to excess. He can regulate reproduction according to needs, but he should not unnecessarily obstruct it. Intelligent human action is a counterbalance established by God to restore balance among the forces of nature, and it is this that distinguishes him from animals as he acts with knowledge. However, animals themselves also contribute to this balance, as the instinct for destruction given to them leads them to curb the excessive and potentially dangerous development of the animal and plant species on which they feed. What should we think of practices that limit reproduction to satisfy sensuality? This demonstrates the predominance of the body over the soul and how inclined man is toward matter. 695. Is marriage the permanent union of two beings, contrary to the law of nature, and does it represent a step forward in humanity's progress? Marriage is one of the first acts of progress in human societies, establishing fraternal solidarity and present in all peoples, though under different conditions. The abolition of marriage would thus be a return to the infancy of humanity and would place man even below some animals that exemplify constant union. 696. What would be the effect of the abolition of marriage on human society? The return to the life of beasts, with the free and random union of the sexes being the natural state. Marriage is one of the first steps in the progress of human societies, establishing fraternal solidarity and present in all peoples, although in different conditions. The abolition of marriage would therefore be a return to humanity's infancy and would place man below even some animals that exemplify constant union. 697. Is the absolute indissolubility of marriage in accordance with the law of nature or only with human law? It is a law very contrary to nature, but men can change their laws. Only the laws of nature are immutable. 698. Is voluntary celibacy a state of merit in the eyes of God? No. Those who live this way out of selfishness displease God and deceive everyone. 699. Is celibacy not a sacrifice of some people to dedicate themselves more fully to the service of humanity? It is very different. As I said, any personal sacrifice is meritorious when it is for the good. The greater the sacrifice, the greater the merit. God cannot contradict himself or find fault in what he has made. Thus, he cannot see merit in the violation of his law. But celibacy itself is not a meritorious state unless it constitutes a sacrifice made for the good of humanity, without any selfish motive. 700. Is the numerical equality between the sexes an indication of the proportion in which they should be united? Yes, for everything has a purpose in nature. 701. Between polygamy and monogamy, which is more in accordance with the law of nature, polygamy is a human law whose abolition marks social progress. Marriage, according to God's vision, should be based on the affection of the united beings. With polygamy there is no true affection, only sensuality. If polygamy were in accordance with the law of nature, it would have to be universal, which is materially impossible due to the numerical equality of the sexes. Polygamy should be considered as a custom or specific legislation adapted to certain traditions, intended to gradually disappear with social perfection in accordance with the law of conservation. 1. Instinct of conservation. 2. Means of conservation. 3. Enjoyment of earthly goods. 4. Necessary and superfluous. 5. Voluntary deprivation, mortifications, instinct of conservation. 702. Is self-preservation a law of nature? Without a doubt, it is present in all living beings, regardless of their level of intelligence. In some, it is purely mechanical, while in others, it is reasoned. 703. For what purpose did God give all living beings the instinct for self-preservation? Because all must work together for the designs of providence. That is why God gave them the need to live, as life is necessary for the perfection of beings. They feel this instinctively without realizing it. 704. Has God always provided man with the means necessary to live? Yes, and if he does not find them, it is because he does not understand them. God could not give man the need to live without also providing the means to do so. That is why he ensures that the earth produces enough to meet the living needs of all its inhabitants, for only the needs of life are useful. The superfluous is never useful. 705. Why does the earth not always produce enough to satisfy human needs? Man neglects it and is ungrateful, yet it is an excellent mother. Often he also blames nature for what is the result of his own incompetence or lack of foresight. The earth would always produce what is necessary if man knew how to be content with it. If it is insufficient for all needs, it is because man uses what could serve the necessary for the superfluous. But when half of the products are wasted to satisfy whims, man should not be surprised to find nothing the next day, and he has the right to complain when the period of scarcity arrives. Truly, I tell you, it is not nature that is unprepared. It is man who does not know how to regulate himself. 706. Should the goods of the earth be understood only as products of the soil? The soil is the primary source from which all other resources come. Ultimately, these resources are merely transformations of soil products. Thus, by goods of the earth, we mean everything that man can enjoy here below. 707. Some people often lack means of subsistence, even amid the abundance around them. Who should they blame? The selfishness of men who do not always do what they should, and more often, they should blame themselves. Seek, and you will find these words. They do not mean that it is enough to look at the soil to find what you desire, but that you must search for it with zeal and perseverance, not laziness, and not be discouraged by obstacles, which are often means to test your constancy, patience, and firmness. If civilization multiplies needs, it also multiplies sources of work and means of subsistence. But it must be admitted that it still has much to do in this area. When it has completed its work, no one should be able to say that the necessities of life are lacking, except through their own fault. The misfortune of many lies in the fact that they take a path not laid out by nature. It is then that they lack the intelligence to succeed. There is room for everyone under the sun, provided they occupy their own place and not that of others. Nature cannot be held responsible for the vices of social organization and the consequences of ambition and self-love. However, one would have to be blind not to recognize the progress made in this regard by the most advanced peoples, thanks to the laudable efforts of philanthropy and science combined to improve the material condition of men. Despite the constant increase in population, the insufficiency of production has been largely mitigated. At least the most calamitous years are nothing compared to those of the past. Public hygiene, an essential element of strength and health unknown to our ancestors, is now a subject of enlightened concern. Misery and suffering find refuge in all sciences which work to increase well-being. Does this mean that perfection has been achieved? Certainly not. But what has been accomplished gives a measure of what can be done with perseverance if man is wise enough to seek his happiness in positive and serious things, rather than in utopias that make him regress rather than advance. 708. Are there situations where means of subsistence do not depend at all on human will, and where the deprivation of the most urgent needs is an unavoidable consequence of circumstances? The merit lies in submission to the will of God if intelligence does not provide any means of escape, and if death occurs, one must resolve to accept it without murmuring, thinking that it is the time for true deliverance, and that despair at the last moment could undo the fruit of one's resignation. 709. Those who in certain critical situations have been compelled to sacrifice their fellow beings for sustenance have committed a crime. If there is a crime, it is mitigated by the necessity of life given to them by the instinct of self-preservation. I have already answered by saying that there is more merit in enduring all the trials of life with courage and selflessness. This is a case of homicide and a crime against nature, an offense that must be punished doubly. 710. In worlds where the organization is more refined, do living beings require food? Yes, but their sustenance is proportional to their nature. Such food would not be substantial enough for the coarse stomachs of humans in the same way that they could not digest their food. 711. Is the use of the earth's goods a right for all men? This right stems from the necessity of life. God could not impose a duty without providing the means to fulfill it. 7.2. For what purpose did God assign a desire for material goods? To stimulate man to accomplish his mission, and also to test him with temptation. What is the purpose of this temptation? To develop his reason, which must protect him from excess. If man had been stimulated to use the earth's goods solely for utilitarian purposes, his indifference could have compromised the harmony of the universe. God gave him the allure of pleasure to push him to fulfill the designs of providence, but through this same attraction, God also intended to test him with temptation that drives him towards abuse, which his reason must defend against. 713. Do pleasures have limits set by nature? Yes, to show them the limit of necessity, but with the excesses of their kind, they reach satiety and are punished. 714. What should we think of a man who seeks in all kinds of excess a refinement of his pleasure, a poor nature that we should pity and not envy, for it is very close to death? Physical death is approaching as well as moral death. One who seeks refinement in all types of excesses is placing himself below the brute, as the brute knows how to stop at satisfying its need, denying the reason God gave as a guide. The greater his excesses, the more his animal nature overtakes his spiritual nature. The diseases, afflictions, and even death that result from abuse are both punishment for transgressing God's law and for indulging in what is necessary and superfluous. 7:15. How can man know the limit of necessity? The wise know it intuitively, while many know it through experience and their own misfortune. 7:16. Has nature not set the limit of our needs through our organization? Yes, but man is insatiable. Nature has set the limit of his needs through his organization, but vices have altered his constitution and created unreal needs. 7:17. What should we think of those who use the earth's goods to obtain the superfluous at the expense of those lacking necessities? They despise the law of God and will have to answer beyond for the deprivations they have inflicted on others. Nothing is absolute in the limit of necessity and superfluous. Civilization has created needs that the savage does not have, and the minds that dictated these precepts do not claim that civilized man should live like a savage. Everything is relative, and it is up to reason to distinguish between each thing. Civilization develops moral sense and at the same time the sense of charity that encourages men to support each other. Those who live at the expense of others' deprivations exploit the benefits of civilization for their own advantage. They only have the veneer of civilization, just as there are people who only have the facade of religion. 7:18. Does the law of conservation require meeting the needs of the body? Yes, because without strength and health, work is impossible. 719. Is it wrong for man to seek well-being? God only prohibits abuse, as abuse is contrary to conservation. The pursuit of well-being does not become a crime if it is not acquired at the expense of others, and does not diminish either your moral or physical strength. 720. Do voluntary deprivations aimed at voluntary atonement have merit in the eyes of God? Do good to others, and you will merit more. Are there voluntary deprivations that are meritorious? Yes, the deprivation of unnecessary pleasures, as it separates man from matter and elevates his soul. The merit lies in resisting temptation that seeks excess or the enjoyment of useless things, in reducing one's own needs to give to those who have not enough. If deprivation is merely a vain pretense, it is mockery. 721. Has the ascetic life of mortification practiced by different peoples since ancient times any merit? Ask yourself who it serves, and you will have the answer. If it only serves the practitioner and prevents him from doing good, it is selfish regardless of the pretext it uses. Denying oneself and working for others is the true mortification according to Christian charity. 722. Is the abstention from certain foods prescribed by various peoples justified? Anything that man can eat without harming his health is permitted, but legislators may have prohibited certain foods for useful purposes and to give more credibility to their laws, presenting them as coming from God. 723. Is the consumption of animal food contrary to the law of human nature in its physical constitution? Meat nourishes the flesh, otherwise man withers. The law of conservation requires man to maintain his strength and health to fulfill the law of labor, so he must nourish himself according to his organization. 724. Is it meritorious to obtain animal or other foods as atonement? Yes, if one deprives oneself for the good of others, but God cannot see mortification when the deprivation is not serious and useful. This is why we say that those who deprive themselves only in appearance are hypocrites. 725. And what about the mutilation of the human or animal body? What is its significance? Ask yourself this question once more. If something is useful, what is useless cannot be pleasing to God, and what is harmful is always displeasing to Him. Know that God is only sensitive to feelings that elevate the soul towards Him. Practicing His law is the only way to rid oneself of earthly matter, not by violating it. 726. If the sufferings of this world elevate us through the way we endure them, those we create voluntarily do not elevate us. Only natural sufferings elevate because they come from God. Voluntary sufferings are useless when they contribute nothing to the good of others. Do you think advancing on one's path involves shortening one's life with superhuman rigors, as ascetics, fakirs, and certain fanatics of various sects do? Should they not rather work for the good of their fellows, clothe the needy, console the afflicted, care for the sick, and endure deprivations to relieve the unfortunate? Then their lives will be useful and pleasing to God. Enduring voluntary sufferings while thinking only of oneself is selfish. Doing it for others is charity. This is the teaching of Christ. 727. If we should not inflict voluntary sufferings that serve no purpose for others, we should try to protect ourselves from what we foresee or what threatens us. The instinct of self-preservation has been given to all beings against danger and suffering that torments their mind, not their body. Mortify pride, stifle selfishness like a serpent that gnaws at your heart, and you will do more for your progress than with rigors that are no longer of this time. 728. Is destruction a law of nature? Everything must be destroyed to be reborn and regenerated, for what you call destruction is nothing but a transformation aimed at the renewal and improvement of living beings. The instinct of destruction has been given to living beings for providential reasons. God's creatures are the instruments he uses to achieve his ends. To feed themselves, living beings destroy each other, with the dual purpose of maintaining balance in reproduction, which could become excessive and utilizing the waste of the external envelope. But only this envelope is destroyed, and this envelope is merely the accessory, non-essential part of the thinking being. The essential part is the intelligent principle, indestructible, which develops itself through the various metamorphoses it undergoes. 729. If destruction is necessary for the regeneration of beings, why does nature surround them with means of preservation and conservation? It is to ensure that destruction does not occur before the necessary time. Any premature destruction hinders the development of the intelligent principle. That is why God has given each being the need to live and reproduce. 730. Since death should lead us to a better life and free use from the ills of this one, and since it is therefore a more desirable than fearful, as man has an instinctive horror of it that makes him fearful, as we have said, man should seek to prolong his life to accomplish his task. That is why God has given him the instinct of self-preservation, and this instinct supports him in trials. Without it, he would become discouraged too often. The secret voice that urges him to reject death tells him that he can still do something for his advancement. When a danger threatens him, it is a warning that he should take advantage of the respite God grants him. But ungrateful man often thanks the stars more than his Creator. 731. Since nature places destructive agents alongside means of conservation, the remedy beside the harm, as we have said, it is to maintain balance and serve as a counterweight. 732. The need for destruction is the same in all worlds, proportional to the more or less material state of the worlds. It ceases with a more refined physical and moral state in worlds more advanced than their own. The conditions of existence there are very different. 733. There will always be a need for destruction among the people of the earth. This need for destruction weakens in humans as the spirit prevails over matter. That is why you see that the horror of destruction follows intellectual and moral development. 734. In its current state, does man have an unlimited right to destroy animals? This right is regulated by the necessity to feed oneself and protect oneself. Abuse has never been a right. 735. What should we think of destruction that exceeds the limits of necessity and security, such as hunting? What should we think when the goal is simply the pleasure of destruction without utility? It is the predominance of bestiality over spiritual nature. Any destruction beyond the limits of necessity is a violation of God's law. Animals only destroy out of necessity, but man, who has free will, destroys without necessity. He will have to account for the abuse of the freedom granted to him. These are then the bad instincts to which he yields. 736. Is there a special merit for peoples who are excessively scrupulous about the destruction of animals? It is an excess in a sentiment that is laudable in itself, but becomes abusive. whose merit is neutralized by other types of abuse. There is more superstitious fear in them than true goodness. 737. For what purpose does God strike humanity with destructive plagues, so that it progresses more quickly? We have not said that destruction is necessary for the moral regeneration of spirits, which draw a new degree of perfection from each new existence. One must see the end to appreciate the results. You judge them only from a personal point of view and call them plagues because of the damage they cause. But these disturbances are often necessary to achieve a better order of things more quickly, in a few years, instead of what would have required many centuries. 738. Couldn't God have used other means for the improvement of humanity besides destructive plagues? Yes, and he uses them every day, having given everyone the means to progress in the knowledge of good and evil. It is man who does not take advantage of them. It is necessary to punish him in his pride and make him feel his weakness. But in these plagues, both the good and the wicked suffer. Is it just during life? Man ties everything to his body, but after death he thinks differently. As we have said, bodily life is brief. A century in your world is a flash in eternity. Thus, the sufferings that some call months or days are nothing. They are a lesson for men and will serve them in the future. Spirits are the real world, existing and surviving everything. They are God's children and the object of all his care. Bodies are merely disguises under which they appear in the world. In great calamities that decimate people, it is like an exercise where during war one sees their clothes worn out, torn or lost. The general cares more about his soldiers than his clothes, but the victims of these plagues are no less victims. If one considers life for what it is, and its smallness in comparison to the infinite, one would grant it less importance. These victims will find great compensation for their sufferings in another existence if they know how to endure them without murmuring. Whether death comes by plague or by ordinary cause, it is equally necessary to die when the time for departure has come. If we could elevate our thoughts to embrace all humanity, these terrible plagues would seem to us only as passing storms in the destiny of the world. 739. Do destructive plagues have a physical utility despite the harm they cause? Yes, sometimes they alter the state of a land, but the good resulting from it is often felt only by future generations. 740. Are they not also moral trials for man, confronting him with the harshest necessities? Plagues are trials that offer man the opportunity to show intelligence, patience, and acceptance of God's will, allowing him to demonstrate feelings of devotion, selflessness, and love for others if he is not dominated by selfishness. 741. Does man have the ability to protect himself against the plagues that strike him? Partly yes, but not always in the way it is generally understood. Many plagues are the result of his lack of foresight. As he gains knowledge and experience, he can ward them off, that is, prevent them if he understands their causes. However, among the ills that afflict humanity, there are some that are inscribed in the decrees of providence, and against which each individual experiences more or less repercussions. In the face of these, man can only show acceptance of God's will, even if these ills are often exacerbated by his negligence. Among the natural and human-independent destructive plagues, we must first classify plague, famine, floods, and unfavorable weather conditions for agricultural production. But how has man found in science, art, agricultural improvements, crop rotation, and irrigation the means to neutralize or at least mitigate many disasters? Are not certain regions, once ravaged by terrible plagues, preserved today thanks to these efforts for material well-being? When he knows how to take advantage of all the resources of his intelligence, and in addition to taking care of his personal behavior, knows how to conjure a true sense of charity towards his fellow men. 742. What is the cause that drives man to war? The predominance of the animal nature over the spiritual nature and the satisfaction of passions. In a state of barbarism, people only know the law of the strongest, which is why war is a normal state for them. As man progresses, war becomes less frequent as he avoids its causes and knows how to associate it with humanity when necessary. 743. Will war ever disappear from the surface of the earth? Yes, when men understand justice and practice God's law, then all peoples will be brothers. 744. What was the purpose of well-being for war to be necessary? Freedom and progress. If the effect of war is to achieve freedom, how is it that its goal and result are often slavery? A temporary slavery to pacify the people in order to achieve more quickly. 745. What should we think of someone who instigates war for personal gain? They are the true culprit and will have to atone for many lives for all the murders they have caused, for they are responsible for each person whose death was caused to satisfy their ambition, a murder. 746. Is murder a crime in the eyes of God? Yes, a great crime, because one who takes another's life cuts off a life of atonement or mission, and that is the evil. 747. Does murder always have the same degree of guilt? As we have said before, God is just and judges more by intent than by the act. 748. Does God forgive murder in self-defense? Only necessity can excuse it, but if one can preserve their life without harming their attacker, they should do so. 749. Is man guilty of the murders he commits during war? No, when he is forced to do so by force, but he is guilty of the cruelties he commits, and his humanity will be taken into account. 750. Who is more guilty in the eyes of God, the parricide or the infanticide? Both are equally guilty. Every crime is a crime. 751. How is it possible that among some peoples already intellectually advanced, infanticide is part of their customs and sanctioned by legislation? Intellectual development does not necessarily imply well-being. A superior mind in intelligence can be evil, as it has lived long without improving. It knows cruelty. 752. Is it possible to link the feeling of cruelty to the instinct of destruction? It is destruction at its worst level, because while destruction is sometimes a necessity, cruelty is never. It is always the result of a bad nature. 753. Why is cruelty the dominant characteristic of primitive peoples? Among these primitive peoples, as you call them, matter prevails over the spirit. They cling to brutal instincts, and having only the necessities of bodily life, they think only of their own preservation, which generally makes them cruel. Thus, peoples with imperfect development are under the influence of equally imperfect spirits who sympathize with them, until more advanced peoples come to destroy or weaken this influence. 754. Does cruelty not indicate the absence of moral sense? One could say that moral sense is underdeveloped, but not absent, as it exists in principle in all humans. It is this moral sense that later makes them good and humane. It is like the savage. It is present like the essence of perfume in the flower bud before it blooms. All faculties exist in humans in a rudimentary or latent state. They develop depending on whether the circumstances are more or less favorable. The excessive development of one faculty halts or neutralizes the others. The overstimulation of material instincts, so to speak, stifles moral sense, just as the development of moral sense gradually weakens purely animal faculties. 755. How is it possible that amidst the most advanced civilization there are sometimes people as cruel as savages? Like a tree laden with good fruit, there are, if you will, remnants of savagery, people who only have the appearance of civilization, wolves among sheep. Spirits of a lower and very backward order can incarnate among advanced humans in the hope of progressing, but if the trial is too severe, their primitive nature prevails. 756. Will the society of good people ever be purged of evil beings? Humanity progresses. Those dominated by the instinct of evil are displaced among the good and will gradually disappear, just as bad grain is separated from the good after being winnowed, but only to be reborn under another guise. This way, they gain more experience to better understand good and evil. An example of this is found in plants and animals that man has learned to perfect and in which he develops new qualities. Thus, only after several generations is improvement complete. This is an image of the different existences of man. 757. Can a duel be considered a case of legitimate self-defense? It is not murder, but an absurd custom worthy of barbarians. With a more advanced and moral civilization, man will understand that dueling is as ridiculous as the battles once considered the judgment of God. 758. Can a duel be considered a homicide when the person, knowing their own weakness, is almost certain to succumb? No, it is suicide. And when the chances are equal, it is both murder and suicide. In all cases, even when the chances are equal, the duelist is guilty first because they coldly and deliberately await the life of their opponent, and second, because they unnecessarily and without benefit to anyone expose their own life. 759. What value does the so-called point of honor in duels have? It is pride and vanity, two scourges within humanity. But are there cases where honor is truly at stake, and refusal would be cowardice? When men are better and more advanced morally, they will understand that true honor surpasses earthly passions, and that killing or being killed is not the correction of evil. There is more greatness and true honor in admitting one's fault if one is wrong or in forgiving if one is right. In both cases, one must scorn insults that cannot affect us. 760. Will the death penalty ever disappear from human legislation? The death penalty will undoubtedly disappear, and its abolition will mark progress in humanity. When men become more enlightened, the death penalty will be completely abolished on earth. Men will no longer need to be judged by other men. I speak of a time that is still far from you. It is undeniable that social progress has much to desire. But it would be unjust for modern society if we did not see progress in the restrictions imposed on the death penalty by the most advanced peoples and in the nature of the crimes to which it applies. If one compares the guarantees with which the justice of these same peoples strives to surround the accused and the humanity with which they are treated even when found guilty with what was practiced not so long ago, one can only recognize the progressive path on which humanity is advancing. 761. The law of conservation grants man the right to preserve his own life. This right is not used by removing a dangerous member from society. There are other means of protecting oneself from danger than killing, and the door to repentance must be open to the criminal, not closed before them. 762. If the death penalty can be banned from civilized societies, it was not a necessity in less advanced times. Necessity is not the word. Man always believes that something is necessary when he finds nothing better. As he becomes enlightened, he better understands what is just or unjust and rejects excesses committed in ignorance in the name of justice. 763. The restriction of cases where the death penalty is applied is a sign of the progress of civilization. You may doubt this. Your mind does not reconcile when you read accounts of human carnage that took place in the past in the name of justice and often in honor of the deity. Tortures were inflicted on the condemned and even on the accused to extract, through excessive suffering, confessions of crimes they often did not commit. Had you lived in that era, you would have found it very natural, and perhaps as a judge, you would have done the same. Thus, what seemed just at one time seems barbaric at another. Only divine laws are eternal. Human laws change with progress and will continue to change until they are in harmony with divine laws. 764. Jesus said, "He who takes up the sword will perish by the sword." Do these words not endorse the penalty of revenge? And is not the death inflicted on a murderer the application of this penalty? Be cautious. You have misinterpreted these words as many others have. The penalty of retribution is God's justice. It is He who applies it. You all undergo this penalty every moment, as you are punished for having sinned in this life or another. Whoever has caused suffering to others will find themselves in a position where they will suffer what they have inflicted on others. This is the meaning of Jesus' words. But did He not also say, "Forgive your enemies"? And did He not teach you to ask God to forgive your offenses as you have forgiven those who have offended you, meaning in the same proportion? This must be well understood. 765. And the death penalty in the name of God, takes God's place in justice. Those who impose it show how far they are from understanding God and have much to atone for. The death penalty is a crime when applied in the name of God, and those who inflict it are guilty of many murders. 766. Social life is certainly part of nature. God indeed created man to live in society. God did not give man speech and all the other faculties necessary for relational life without reason. 767. Absolute isolation is contrary to the law of nature. Yes, because men seek society by instinct, and everyone must contribute to progress by helping one another. 768. In seeking society, does man merely obey a personal feeling, or does this feeling have a more general providential purpose? Man cannot progress alone, as he does not have all the faculties. He needs contact with other men. In isolation, he becomes stagnant and withers. No man possesses all faculties completely. Through society, they complement each other to ensure their well-being and progress. Thus, needing one another, they are made to live in society rather than in isolation. A life of isolation is a vow of silence. 769. It is conceivable that as a general principle, social life is in nature, but since all tastes are equally natural, why condemn absolute isolation? If man finds satisfaction in it, it is a selfish pleasure. There are also men who find satisfaction in intoxication. This too is a trial. God cannot approve of a life where we condemn ourselves to being useless to anyone. 770. What should be thought of people who live in complete seclusion to escape the pernicious contact of the world? They live in double selfishness. But if the purpose of this withdrawal is to atone by imposing a painful deprivation on oneself, it is not praiseworthy to do more harm than good. The best atonement by avoiding one evil falls into another, as they forget the law of love and charity. What should be thought of those who flee the world to devote themselves to the unfortunate? These people rise by lowering themselves. They have the dual merit of placing themselves above material pleasure and of doing good while respecting the law of work. What can be said of those who seek the peace and tranquility of retreat necessary for certain tasks? It is not a selfish abandonment, as they do not isolate themselves from society, but work for it. What should be thought of the vow of silence prescribed by certain sects? Since ancient times, one should rather ask why it speaks if it is in nature, and why God granted it. God condemns abuse, but not the use of the faculties he has granted. However, silence is useful as it gathers your mind and makes it freer, allowing communication with oneself. However, taking a vow of silence is foolish. Undoubtedly, those who consider these voluntary deprivations as acts of virtue have good intentions, but they are mistaken, as they do not sufficiently understand the true laws of God. The vow of absolute silence, just like the vow of isolation, deprives man of social relations that can offer opportunities to do good and to respect the law of familial progress. Why do parents and children no longer recognize each other among animals once they no longer need care? Animals live a material life and not a moral one. The mother's tenderness toward her young stems from the instinct to preserve the beings she has brought into the world, but once these beings are capable of being independent, her task is complete and nature does not require more from her. This is why she abandons them to care for the newborns. There are people who conclude from the abandonment of the young by animals that for humans, familial bonds are merely the result of social customs and not a law of nature. What should we think? Man has a different destiny from that of animals. Why should we always seek to compare them? In man, there is more than physical needs. There is the need for progress. Social bonds are necessary for progress, and familial bonds reinforce social bonds. Thus, familial bonds are a law of nature. God wanted humans to learn to love each other as brothers in this way. What would be the result for society of relaxing familial bonds, an increase in selfishness? The law of progress. 1. State of nature. 2. March of progress. 3. Degenerated peoples. 4. Civilization. 5. Progress of human legislation. 6. Influence of Spiritism on progress. The state of nature and natural law are not the same thing. The state of nature is the primitive state. civilization is incompatible with the state of nature. While natural law contributes to the progress of humanity, the state of nature represents humanity's infancy and the starting point of its intellectual and moral development. Since man is perfectible and carries within himself the seed of his own perfection, he is not destined to live eternally in the state of nature, just as he is not destined to remain forever in infancy. The state of nature is transitional, and man emerges from it through progress and civilization. In contrast, natural law governs all humanity, and man improves as he better understands and practices this law. In the state of nature, man, having fewer needs, does not experience all the tribulations believed to exist in a more advanced state. What should be thought of those who consider this state to be the most perfect happiness on earth? It is the way brutes find happiness. There are people who understand nothing other than being happy in the manner of beasts. Children are happier than adult men. Can man regress to the state of nature? No, man must constantly progress and cannot return to a state of infancy. If he progresses, it is because God wills it so. To think that he could return to his primitive condition would be to deny the law of progress. Does man derive a progressive force from within himself, or is progress simply the result of teaching? Man develops naturally, but not everyone progresses at the same rate or in the same way. That is why the more advanced help in the progress of others through social contact. Moral progress always follows intellectual progress. It is its consequence, but not always immediately. How can intellectual progress lead to moral progress? By helping people understand good and evil, man can then freely choose. The development of free will follows the development of intelligence and increases the responsibility for actions. So why are the most educated people often the most perverted? Complete progress is the goal, but peoples, like individuals, achieve it only step by step. Until moral sense has developed within them, they may even use their intelligence to do harm. Morality and intelligence are two forces that only balance out in the long term. Is it possible for man to stop the march of progress? No, but he can sometimes hinder it. What should be thought of men who attempt to halt the march of progress and roll back humanity? They are poor creatures whom God will punish. They will be overthrown by the torrent they seek to stop. Since progress is a condition of human nature, no one can oppose it. It is a living force that bad laws can delay, but not stifle. When these laws become incompatible with it, progress breaks them, along with all who attempt to maintain them. And this will continue until man adjusts his laws to divine justice, which desires the good for all, rather than laws made by the strong at the expense of the weak. There are no men who hinder progress in good faith while believing they promote it, as they often view it from their own perspective, which is not always correct. A small stone placed under the wheel of a large cart does not prevent it from moving forward. The improvement of humanity always follows a gradual and slow pace. There is a constant and slow progress that results from the force of things. But when a people does not advance quickly enough, God sometimes causes a physical or moral upheaval that transforms it. Man cannot remain eternally in ignorance, as he must reach the goal set by providence. Moral revolutions, like social revolutions, gradually infiltrate ideas. They germinate over centuries and then suddenly burst forth, overturning the decayed edifice of the past that is no longer in harmony with new necessities and aspirations. Man often sees in these upheavals only the disorder and temporary confusion that affect his material interests. One who raises their thought above personal concerns admires the designs of providence which brings good out of evil. It is the storm and the tempest that clear the atmosphere after having disrupted it. The perversity of man is great, and it seems that he is moving backward rather than forward, at least from a moral standpoint. But you are mistaken. Observe the whole picture, and you will see that progress is being made, as humanity understands evil better, and reforms abuses day by day. It is the excess of evil that makes people understand the necessity of good and reforms. What is the greatest obstacle to progress? Pride and selfishness. I'm referring to moral progress. Intellectual progress is always ongoing, and even at first glance it seems to intensify these vices by developing ambition and the love of wealth, which in turn drives man to pursuits that enlighten his mind. Thus, everything is maintained in the moral world as in the physical world, and how good can even emerge from evil itself. But this state of affairs will only last for a time. It will change when man better understands that there is an infinitely greater and more lasting happiness beyond the enjoyment of earthly goods. See Scripture, chapter 12. There are two types of progress that support each other, but do not necessarily go hand in hand: intellectual progress and moral progress. Among civilized peoples, the former has received all the desirable stimulus in this century and has reached an unprecedented level, while the latter is still far from being at the same level. However, when comparing social customs from a few centuries ago, one would have to be blind to deny progress, as the upward progression must now be more hindered by morality than by intelligence. Why should there not be as much difference between the 19th and 20th centuries as between the 14th and 19th? To doubt this would be to assert that humanity is at the peak of perfection, which would be absurd, or that humanity is not morally perfectible, which is contradicted by the existence of degenerated peoples. History shows us a multitude of peoples who, after the convulsions that shook them, fell back into barbarism. Where is progress in this case? When your house is in danger of collapsing, you demolish it to build a more solid and suitable one. But until it is rebuilt, there are problems and confusion. Imagine that you were once poor and lived in a slum, that you became wealthy and left it to live in a palace. Then a poor person like you comes to occupy your former place in the slum and is very happy because previously he had no shelter. Similarly, understand that the spirits incarnated in these degenerated peoples are not the same as those that composed that people during its time of splendor. Those who were advanced at that time have moved to more perfect dwellings and have progressed, while others less advanced have taken their place, which they will leave in turn. There are no races inherently resistant to progress, but these are physically becoming extinct every day. What will be the future destiny of the souls animating these races? They will achieve perfection through several existences, just like all others. God excludes no one. Thus, even the most civilized peoples could have been savage and cannibalistic. You yourself were so more than once before becoming what you are now. Peoples are collective individualities that, just like individuals, go through childhood, maturity, and decrepitude. This truth, recognized by history, cannot lead to the belief that the most advanced peoples of this century will face their decline at their end like those of antiquity. Peoples who live solely for physical life, whose grandeur rests only on strength and size, are born, grow, and die, because the strength of a people wears out just like that of a man. Those whose selfish laws are at odds with the progress of enlightenment and clarity die, for light dispels darkness, and clarity dispels selfishness. But there exists for peoples, just as for individuals, the life of the soul. Those whose laws are in harmony with the eternal laws of the Creator will live and be a beacon for other peoples. Will progress one day unite all the peoples of the earth into one nation? No, this is not possible, as the diversity of climates gives rise to different customs and needs that constitute nationalities. Therefore, they will always need laws adapted to these customs and needs. But charity knows no latitudes and makes no distinction between the colors of men. When the law of God becomes the foundation of human law everywhere, peoples will practice charity towards one another, as individuals do from person to person. Then they will live happily and peacefully, for no one will seek to harm their neighbor or live at their expense. Humanity progresses through individuals who gradually improve and enlighten themselves. Then, when they predominate in number, they take control and lead others. Among them emerge geniuses who give impetus, then authoritative figures, instruments of God, who advance in a few years what would have taken several centuries. The progress of peoples evidently continues to demand the justice of reincarnation. Good men make commendable efforts to advance a nation morally and intellectually. The transformed nation will be happier in this world and the next, let it be so. But in its slow march through the centuries, thousands die every day. What is the fate of those who succumb along the way? Does their relative inferiority deprive them of the happiness reserved for the final arrivals, or is their happiness relative? Divine justice cannot sanction such injustice, For through the plurality of existences, the right to happiness is the same for all. Since no one is deprived of progress, those who lived in the age of barbarism can return in the age of civilization, either with the same people or with another. It follows that all benefit from upward progression. But the system of the unity of existences presents another difficulty. With this system, the soul is created at the moment of birth. Thus, if one man is more advanced than another, it is because God creates him a more advanced soul. But what merit does one have who has not lived more than another, often even less, to be endowed with a superior soul? However, this is not the main difficulty. A nation evolves from barbarism to civilization over 1,000 years. If men lived 1,000 years, it would be conceivable that they could progress during that interval. But every day, men die at every age, constantly renewing, so that each day sees certain individuals appear and disappear. After 1,000 years, no trace remains of the former inhabitants. The nation, once barbaric, has become civilized. It was the individuals of the past who were barbaric, but they have long been dead. It is the newcomers, but if their souls are created at the moment of their birth, these souls did not exist at the time of barbarism. It must then be admitted that the efforts made to civilize a people do not have the power to improve imperfect souls, but rather to attract those that are already more advanced. These souls are drawn by an environment that is favorable to them and in proportion to their current state. Thus, the efforts made towards the civilization of a people do not create more perfect souls for the individual, but attract those that have already progressed. This is the key to the progress of humanity as a whole. When all peoples reach the same level in terms of moral sense, the earth will be a meeting place only for good spirits, who will live together in a fraternal union. As for the wicked, repelled and displaced by the contrast, they will seek out their suitable environment in their lower worlds, until they are worthy of coming to our transformed world. The common theory also has the consequence that social improvement only benefits the present and future generations. Its result is null for past generations, who were unfortunate enough to come too early and are burdened with the acts of barbarism they committed. According to the doctrine of spirits, further progress also benefits these generations, as they return to life in better conditions and can thus perfect themselves within the realm of civilization. Is civilization a progress, or according to some philosophers, a decline of humanity? An incomplete progress. Man does not suddenly move from childhood to maturity. It is irrational to condemn civilization. It is better to condemn those who abuse it, not the work of God. Will civilization one day purify itself to the point where the evils it has produced will disappear? Yes, when morality is as developed as intelligence. The fruit cannot come before the flower. Why does civilization not immediately realize all the good it could produce? Because men are not yet ready or willing to obtain this good. Will it not be because, by creating new needs, it excites new passions? Yes, and because all the faculties of the mind do not progress at the same time. Everything takes time. One cannot expect perfect fruits from an incomplete civilization. What are the signs of a complete civilization? You will recognize it by moral development. Men believe they are very advanced because they have made great discoveries and incredible inventions, that they are better housed and better dressed than savages. But they do not truly have the right to call themselves civilized as long as they have not eradicated from their society the vices that dishonor them, and do not live as brothers, practicing Christian charity. Until then, they are merely enlightened peoples who have only taken the first step of civilization. Civilization has its degrees like everything else. An incomplete civilization is a transitional state that generates specific evils unknown to the primitive state. However, it remains a natural and necessary progress that carries within it the remedy to what it creates. As civilization improves, it ends some of the evils it has generated, and these evils will disappear with moral progress. Among the two peoples who have reached the top of the social ladder, only the first can truly be considered the most civilized in the true sense of the term. Where there is less selfishness, greed, and pride, where customs are more intellectual and moral than material, where intelligence can develop with greater freedom, where there is more kindness, good faith, benevolence, and mutual generosity, where caste and birth prejudices are less entrenched, as these prejudices are incompatible with true love for one's neighbor, where laws do not establish any privilege and are equal for the last as for the first, where justice is exercised with the least partiality, where the weak always find support against the strong, where human life, beliefs, and opinions are better respected, where there are fewer unhappy individuals, and finally, where every man of goodwill is almost always assured of not lacking the necessities of life. This is the progress of human legislation. Could society be governed solely by natural laws without the aid of human laws? They could coexist well if the will to practice them were sufficient. But society has its own demands and needs specific laws. What is the cause of the instability of human laws? In barbaric times, the strong made the laws for themselves. They had to be modified as men understood justice better. Human laws are more stable when they approach true justice, that is, when they are made for everyone, and come as close as possible to natural law. Civilization has created new needs for man, related to his social position, requiring the regulation of rights and duties through human laws. However, under the influence of their passions, men have often created imaginary rights and duties condemned by natural law, which peoples eliminate from their codes as they progress. Natural law is immutable and the same for all, while human law is variable and progressive. Only it has been able to enshrine in the infancy of societies the right of the strongest. Is the severity of penal laws a necessity in the current state of society? A corrupt society certainly needs harsher laws. Unfortunately, these laws are more concerned with punishing the wrong done than with stemming the source of the wrong. Only education can reform men, and then they will no longer need such rigorous laws. How can we lead man to reform his laws? This comes naturally through the force of circumstances and the influence of good people who guide him on the path of progress. It has already reformed many and will reform many more. Expect the influence of Spiritism on progress. Will Spiritism become a popular belief or remain the domain of a few? Certainly, it will become a common belief and mark a new era in the history of humanity, as it is in its nature, and the time has come for it to take its place among human knowledge. However, it will face great struggles, primarily against self-interest rather than conviction. It should not be hidden that some are interested in opposing it, some out of vanity, others for entirely material reasons. But the opponents, increasingly isolated, will be forced to think like everyone else or risk ridicule. Ideas only transform over the long term, and never suddenly. They weaken from generation to generation, and eventually disappear little by little, replaced by new individuals imbued with new principles, as happened with political ideas. Look at paganism. Today, no one professes the religious ideas of that era, yet several centuries after the advent of Christianity, they left traces that only a complete renewal of races could erase. The same will happen with Spiritism, which makes progress but will face a wave of skepticism for 2 or 3 more generations, which only time will dissipate. However, its progress will be faster than that of Christianity, because Christianity itself paves the way for it, upon which it rests. Christianity had to destroy Spiritism. It only has to build upon it. How can Spiritism contribute to progress by destroying materialism, one of the ills of society? It makes men understand where their true interest lies. When doubt about the future life ceases to be obscured, man will better understand that he can secure his future by destroying prejudices of sect, caste, and color. It teaches men the great solidarity that should unite them as brothers. Do you not fear that Spiritism may not overcome human indifference and attachment to material things? It would be a deep misunderstanding of humans to think that any cause could transform them magically. Ideas change gradually according to individuals, and it takes generations to completely erase the traces of old habits. Transformation can therefore only occur over the long term, progressively, from generation to generation. With each generation, a part of the veil is lifted. Spiritism pulls it off completely. But in the meantime, even if it only corrects one fault in a person, it is a step forward, and thus a great good, as this first step will facilitate the next ones. Why have the spirits not taught what they teach today since time immemorial? They teach children what is taught to adults, and one does not give a newborn food that it cannot digest. Everything has its time. They have taught many things that people have not understood or have distorted, but now they can understand through their teaching. Although partial, they have prepared the ground to receive the seed that will now bear fruit. Since Spiritism is to mark progress in humanity, why do the spirits not hasten this progress with such general and obvious manifestations that even the most skeptical would be convinced? They would like miracles, but God sows them with his hands under their feet, and there are still men who deny him. Even Christ convinced his contemporaries through the miracles he performed. Do you not see that today's people deny the most evident facts happening before their eyes? Do you not see that some say they would not believe even if they saw? No, it is not through miracles that God wants to lead men to goodness. He wants them to have the merit of convincing themselves through reason. Are all men equal before God? Yes, everyone works toward the same goal, and God has made his laws for all. Often you say that the sun shines for everyone, and here you state a greater and more general truth than you think. All men are subject to the same laws of nature, all are born with the same weakness, are subject to the same pains, and the body of the rich is destroyed, just like that of the poor. Thus, God has given no man natural superiority, neither by birth nor by death. All are equal before him. 804. Why has God not given the same abilities to all men? God created all spirits equal, but each has lived more or less, and therefore has acquired more or less. The difference lies in the degree of their experience and in their will, which is free will. The mix of talents is necessary for everyone to contribute to the designs of providence, according to the development of their physical and intellectual faculties. What one does not do, another does. Thus everyone has their useful role. Since all worlds are interdependent, it is necessary for the inhabitants of higher worlds, most created before yours, to come and live there to set an example for you. When a spirit moves from a higher world to a lower world, it retains all the faculties it has acquired. As we have already said, a spirit that has progressed does not regress. It may choose, in its state of spirit, a more rudimentary envelope or a more precarious position than it had, but all this always serves to instruct it and help it progress. Thus, the diversity of human aptitudes does not result from the intrinsic nature of its creation, but from the degree of perfection attained by the spirits incarnated in it. Therefore, God did not create inequality of faculties, but allowed different degrees of development to interact with each other, so that the more advanced help the less advanced to progress, and also so that men, needing each other, understand the law of charity that should unite them. Is the inequality of social conditions a law of nature and not a work of man, and will it disappear someday? Nothing is eternal except the laws of God. 807. Do you not see that this inequality decreases little by little every day? It will disappear with the predominance of pride and selfishness. Only the inequality of merits will remain. The day will come when the members of God's family will no longer regard each other based on greater or lesser purity of blood. Only the spirit will be more or less pure, regardless of social position. What should we think of those who abuse the superiority of their social position to oppress the weak for their own benefit? They deserve condemnation. Woe to them! They will in turn be oppressed and will be reborn into an existence where they will suffer all that they have inflicted upon others. The inequality of wealth does not stem from the inequality of faculties that give some more means of acquisition than others. This is both true and false. What about cunning and theft? But is inherited wealth not the fruit of bad passions? Go back to the source and you will see that it remains pure. Do you know if it is not primarily a fruit of injustice? But without mentioning the origin, it can still be bad. Do you think that even greed for acquired wealth is a praiseworthy sentiment? It is God who judges, and I assure you that his judgment is harsher than that of men. If a fortune has a bad origin, those who inherit it are not responsible. However, they must know that often the fortune is given to them to correct an injustice. Blessed is the one who understands this and acts accordingly. Both will be responsible for repairing the injustice committed, for it is often the latter who is the cause. Without breaking the law, one can manage one's wealth in a more or less fair manner. We are responsible after death for the dispositions we have made. Every action bears its fruit. The fruits of good actions are sweet, while those of others are always bitter. Always remember this. Is absolute equality of wealth possible, and has it ever existed? No, it is not possible. The diversity of faculties and characters opposes it. However, there are men who believe that it is the remedy for society's ills. What do you think of them? Are they systematic or ambitious and jealous? They do not understand that the equality they dream of would soon be broken by the force of things. Fight against selfishness, which is your social scourge, and do not pursue chimera. 812. If equality of wealth is not possible, is the same true for well-being? No, well-being is relative, and everyone could enjoy it if it were well distributed. True well-being consists of using one's time as one wishes, not working without pleasure. Since everyone has different aptitudes, there would be no useful work left if everything were balanced. Everything is the man who wants to disturb this balance. It is possible to get along well. Men will do so when they practice the law of justice. There are people who fall into poverty and misery through their own fault. Society cannot be held responsible for this. As we have said before, often the primary cause is their own mistakes, and it should not be responsible for their moral education either. Often poor education has skewed their judgment instead of stifling the harmful tendencies within them. Why did God give some people wealth and power, and others misery, to test them differently? As you know, it is the spirits themselves who chose these trials and often succumb to them. Which is the more formidable trial for a person, misfortune or fortune? They are equally formidable. Misery provokes murmurs against providence, while wealth excites all excesses. If the rich have more temptations, do they not also have more means to do good? That is fair, but they do not always do so. They often become selfish, proud, and insatiable. Their needs grow with their wealth, and they think they never have enough for themselves. Advancement in this world and authority over others are as great and slippery trials as misfortune. For the richer and more powerful one is, the more obligations one has to fulfill, and the greater the means to do good or evil. God tests the poor by resignation and the rich by how they use their wealth and power. Wealth and power generate all the passions that tie us to the material and distance us from spiritual perfection. That is why Jesus said, "It is easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven." Are men and women equal before God, and do they have the same rights? Has God not given them all the understanding of good and evil, as well as the ability to progress? 1818. Where does the moral inferiority of women in some countries come from? It is the result of the unjust and cruel domination that men have exerted over them, stemming from social institutions and the abuse of power over weakness. In morally underdeveloped men, force imposes what is just. Why does the woman have greater physical weakness than the man, justifying specific tasks? Man is destined for hard work due to his strength, while the woman is destined for gentle work, and both help each other in the trials of a bitter life. The physical weakness of woman does not naturally place them under the dependence of men. God gives strength to protect the weak, not to enslave them. God has adapted the organization of each being to the functions they must fulfill. If God has given women less physical strength, He has also endowed them with greater sensitivity, in accordance with the delicacy of their maternal functions and the weakness of the beings entrusted to them. The functions to which a woman is naturally destined are as important as those of a man, if not greater. She is the one who imparts the first notions of life. Are men equal before the law of God and before human law? This is the first principle of justice. Do not do to others what you would not want done to you. Consequently, in order to be perfectly just, laws must enshrine equality of rights between men and women. Rights, yes; functions, no. Each should have an assigned role. Men should take care of the outside, and women of the inside, each according to their capacities. To be equitable, human law must enshrine equality of rights between men and women. Any privilege granted to one or the other is contrary to justice. The emancipation of women follows the progress of civilization. Their subjugation follows the progress of barbarism. The sexes exist only through their physical organization. As spirits can take either role, there is no difference between them in this regard, and thus they should enjoy the same rights. Equality before the grave. 823. Where does the desire to perpetuate one's memory with funerary monuments, the last act of pride, come from? But is it not often the ostentation of funerary monuments the result of relatives wanting to honor the memory of the deceased rather than the deceased himself? The pride of relatives wanting to glorify themselves? Oh yes, it is not always for the benefit of the dead that such demonstrations are made. It is out of vanity and for show to flaunt their wealth. Do you believe that the memory of a loved one is less enduring than the heart of the poor, who can only place a flower on their grave? Do you think that marble saves from oblivion one who was useless on earth? Do you absolutely condemn the pomp of funerals? No, when honoring the memory of a good person, it is just and a good example. The grave is the meeting place of all men. Their all human distinctions end mercilessly. In vain would the rich wish to perpetuate their memory with sumptuous monuments. Time will destroy them as it does the body, and nature will do so as well. The memory of one's good and bad deeds will be less ephemeral than the tomb. The pomp of funerals will not cleanse one's impurities, nor will it elevate one in the spiritual hierarchy. Law of liberty, natural freedom, slavery, freedom of thought, freedom of conscience, free will, fatal victims, knowledge of the future, theoretical summary of the motive of human actions, natural freedom. Is there a position in the world where a person can boast of enjoying absolute freedom? No, for everyone needs each other, both the small and the great. What would be the condition under which a person could enjoy absolute freedom? The hermit in the desert. As soon as there are two people together, they have rights to respect, and therefore no longer have absolute freedom. Does the obligation to respect others' rights deprive a person of the right to belong to oneself freely? Yes, for it is a right they have by nature. How can we reconcile the liberal opinions of some people with the despotism they often exercise in their homes and over their subordinates? They have the intelligence of natural law, but it is thwarted by pride and selfishness. 829. They understand what their principles should be. They are not a comedy played by logic, but will not be considered in the other life. The principles they have professed here on earth. The more intelligence one has to understand a principle, the less excuse there is for not applying it to oneself. Truly, I tell you that a simple but sincere man is farther along the path to God than one who seeks to appear what he is not. Is slavery an inherent condition for some people by nature? Absolute control of one person over another is contrary to the law of God. Slavery is an abuse of power and disappears with progress, like all abuses. The human law that enshrines slavery is a law against nature because it equates man with the brute and morally and physically degrades him. When slavery is part of a people's customs, those who benefit from it are blameworthy as they merely adapt to a custom that seems natural to them. Evil is always bad, and all your arguments will not make a bad action good. However, the responsibility for evil is relative to the means by which it is understood. He who benefits from the law of slavery is always guilty of a violation of the law of nature. But in this, as in all things, guilt is relative. However, once reason is more developed and especially enlightened by the lights of Christianity, it has demonstrated that the slave is equal before God and has no excuse. Natural inequality in capacities does not place certain human races under the dependence of the more intelligent ones. Yes, to elevate them, not to make them more brutish through servitude. Men have regarded certain races as mere working animals with arms and hands, believing they had the right to sell them as beasts of burden. They think they have purer blood, fools who see only matter. It is not the blood that is more or less pure, but the spirit. There are men who treat their slaves humanely, ensuring they lack nothing, and who believe that freedom would expose them to greater hardships. What do you say? I say that these men understand their own interests better. They also take great care of their oxen and horses to gain better profit in the market. They are not as guilty as those who mistreat them, but they still treat them as commodities, depriving them of the right to their own freedom of thought. 833. There is something in man that escapes all restriction, and through which he enjoys absolute freedom. It is in thought that man enjoys unlimited freedom, for it knows no chains. It can be stopped, but not destroyed. Is man responsible for his own thoughts? He is responsible before God, for only God can know them, and he condemns or absolves them according to justice. Is freedom of conscience a consequence of freedom of thought? Conscience is an intimate thought that belongs to man, just like all other thoughts. Does man have the right to hinder freedom of conscience? No more than freedom of thought, for only God has the right to judge conscience. If man regulates by his laws the relations among men, God, through the laws of nature, regulates the relations between man and God. What is the result of restrictions on freedom of conscience? Forcing people to act differently from what they think makes them hypocrites. Freedom of conscience is one of the characteristics of true civilization and progress. Is every belief respectable, even if it is notoriously false? Every belief is respectable when it is sincere and leads to the practice of good. Blamable beliefs are those that lead to evil. Is it wrong to scandalize one's own belief to those who do not think like us? It is uncharitable and an attack on freedom of thought. Does interfering with beliefs that may disturb society constitute an infringement of freedom of conscience? We can suppress actions, but inner belief is inaccessible. Suppressing external acts of a belief when they harm others does not infringe on freedom of conscience, as this suppression leaves the belief completely free. Should we, out of respect for freedom of conscience, allow the propagation of harmful doctrines? Or can we, without violating this freedom, attempt to guide those who stray by false principles back to the path of truth? It is certainly possible and even necessary, but we should teach by following the example of Jesus with gentleness and persuasion, not by force, which would be worse than the belief of the person we wish to convince. If there is something that can be imposed, it is goodness and brotherhood, but we do not believe that the way to have them accepted is through violence. Conviction cannot be imposed. 842. Since all doctrines claim to be the sole expression of truth, by what signs can we recognize the one that has the right to make that claim? It will be the one that produces the most good people and the fewest hypocrites. That is, by practicing the law of love and charity in its greatest purity and extent. By this sign, you will know that a doctrine is good, for any doctrine that results in sowing division and establishing separation among the children of God can only be false and harmful. Does man have free will over his actions? Just as he has the freedom to think, he also has the freedom to act. Without free will, man would be a machine. Does man have free will from birth? There is freedom to act as soon as there is a will to do so. At the earliest stages of life, freedom is almost non-existent. It develops and changes object with the faculties. A child who has thoughts related to the needs of their age applies their free will to necessary things. Do the instinctive predispositions that man brings at birth obstruct the exercise of free will? Instinctive predispositions belong to man before his incarnation. Depending on whether he is more or less advanced, they may push him toward blamable actions, and he will be aided in this by spirits who sympathize with these dispositions. However, there is no irresistible impulse when the will to resist is present. Remember that to want is to be able. Does organization influence the acts of life? If it does, it is not at the expense of free will. Thus, in worlds where bodies are less material than on earth, faculties unfold with more freedom. But the instrument does not provide the faculty. If a man has the instinct to kill, it is his own spirit that possesses and gives it to him, not his organs. He who destroys his thoughts to focus only on matter becomes like a brute, or even worse, because he no longer thinks to guard against evil, and it is in this that he sins, as he acts of his own free will. See Numbers 367 and following on the influence of the organism. 847. The aberration of faculties deprives a man of his free will. One whose intelligence is disturbed by some cause is no longer master of his own thoughts, and therefore no longer has freedom. This aberration is often a punishment for the spirit which, in a previous existence, may have been vain and proud, and may have misused its faculties. It may be reborn in the body of a fool, just as a despot is reborn in the body of a slave and a wealthy man in that of a beggar. But the spirit undergoes this constraint, of which it is perfectly aware. This is the action of matter. 848. The aberration of intellectual faculties through intoxication excuses wrongdoing, not because the drunkard has voluntarily deprived himself of reason to satisfy brutal passions, but rather because in committing one fault he commits two. 849. What is the dominant faculty in man in this wild state, instinct or free will? It is instinct, which does not prevent him from acting with total freedom in certain matters, but like a child, he applies this freedom to his needs and develops with intelligence. Therefore, you are more educated than a savage, and also more responsible for what you do than a savage. 850. Is social position not sometimes an obstacle to total freedom of action? The world certainly has its demands. God, being just, takes everything into account, but leaves you responsible for the little effort you make to overcome obstacles, these mortal victims. 851. Is there a fatality in the events of life according to the meaning given to this word, that is, that all events are predetermined? If so, what happens to free will? Fatality only exists through the choice the spirit makes when incarnating to submit to this or that trial. By choosing, it creates a sort of destiny that directly follows from the situation it finds itself in. I am talking about physical trials. As for moral trials and temptations, the spirit, retaining its free will regarding good and evil, remains always master of yielding or resisting. A good spirit, seeing that it is weakening, may receive help, but it cannot influence to dominate its will. A bad spirit, that is, an inferior spirit, by exaggerating a physical danger, may shake and frighten it, but the will of the incarnated spirit remains free from all obstacle. 852. There are people whom destiny seems to pursue regardless of their actions. Is bad luck not in their destiny? These may be trials they must undergo and have chosen. But once again, you attribute to destiny what is often simply the consequence of your own fault in the ills that afflict you. Strive to keep your conscience pure, and you will be half consoled. The good or bad ideas we have about what makes us succeed or fail according to our character and social position, it is easier and less humiliating for our self-esteem to attribute our failures to chance or destiny. If the influence of spirits sometimes contributes, we can always avoid it by rejecting the ideas they suggest when they are bad. 853. Some people escape a mortal danger only to fall into another. It seems as if they could not escape death. There is no fatality. Nothing is fatal in the true sense of the word, except the moment of death. When that moment comes, whether by one means or another, you cannot escape it. So no matter what danger we face, we will not die if our time has not come. There are thousands of examples of this. But when the time to leave comes, nothing can save us. God knows in advance what kind of death you will face here, and often your spirit knows it too, as it is revealed to it when it makes its choice for this or that existence. 854. From the infallibility of the time of death, it follows that the concerns we take to avoid it are useless. Not that the precautions you take to avoid imminent death are in vain, they are one of the means to avoid it. 855. What is the purpose of providence in exposing us to dangers we should not suffer when our lives are in danger? It is a warning that you yourself desire to turn you away from evil and make you better. When you escape that danger, still under the influence of the threat you faced, you think more or less firmly according to the stronger or weaker action of good spirits to strengthen you. When the evil spirit comes, I say evil implying the malice that is still in it, you also think that you will escape other dangers again, and you let yourself fall into your passions with the dangers you face. God reminds you of your weakness and the fragility of your existence. If we examine the cause and nature of the danger, we will see that most of the time the consequences would have been the punishment for a fault committed or a neglected duty. Thus, God warns you to reflect upon yourself and correct your ways. 856. The spirit knows in advance the type of death it must succumb to. It knows that the type of life it chooses exposes it to die in that way and not otherwise. But it also knows the struggles it should endure to avoid it, and if it is permitted by God, it will not succumb. 857. There are men who face the dangers of battle with the conviction that their time has not yet come. Does this confidence have a basis? Very often, a person has a premonition of their end, just as they may have a premonition that they will not die yet. This premonition comes from their protective spirits, who either want to warn them to prepare for departure or to boost their morale when it is most needed. It may also come from the intuition they have of the existence they have chosen or the mission they have accepted and know they must accomplish. 858. Why do those who foresee their own death often fear it less than others? It is the man who fears death, not the spirit who foresees it. The spirit thinks more as a spirit than as a man, understands its liberation, and awaits it. 859. If death cannot be avoided when it is meant to occur, the same applies to all accidents that happen during life. Often these are small enough that we can be warned about them and sometimes avoid them by directing our thoughts. For we do not like material suffering, but it matters little for the life we have chosen. Fatality actually resides only in the moment when you must appear and disappear here below. There are events that must necessarily occur and which the will of the spirits cannot avoid. Yes, but you have seen and felt them in your state of mind when you made your choice. However, do not believe that everything that happens is written, as they say. An event is often the consequence of an act of your free will. Thus, if you burn your finger, it is nothing but the result of your own imprudence and the consequence of the affair. Only great pains, significant events that can influence your morality, are foreseen by God, as they are useful for your purification and instruction. 860. Can man, with his will and actions, prevent events that are supposed to occur from happening, and vice versa? If this apparent deviation can fit into the life he has chosen, then doing good as it should be is the only purpose of life. Can he avoid evil, particularly that which could lead to greater harm? 8161. Does man know that by choosing his existence, if he commits a murder, he will become a murderer? He does not know that by choosing a life of struggle, there is a possibility that he might kill one of his companions, but he does not know if he will. For almost always there is liberation within him before committing the crime, and one who is liberated concerning a matter is always free to do it or not. If a spirit knew in advance that it must commit a murder as a man, it is because it was predestined to do so. Know then that no one is predestined to commit a crime, and that every crime or act is always the result of will and free will. Furthermore, you always confuse two very different things: the material facts of life and the acts of moral life. If there is sometimes fatality, it is in these material events whose cause is external to you and independent of your will. As for the acts of moral life, they always come from the person themselves, who therefore always has the freedom of choice for these acts. There is thus never any fatality. 862. There are people for whom nothing seems to succeed and who seem pursued by an evil genius in all their endeavors. Is this what could be called fatality? Indeed, it is a fatality, if you wish to call it that, but it relates to the choice of the type of existence, as these people wanted to be tested by a life of disappointment to exercise their patience and resignation. However, do not think that this fatality is absolute. Often, it is the result of the wrong path they have taken, which does not correspond to their intelligence and abilities. One who wants to swim across a river without knowing how to swim is very likely to drown. Thus it is in most events of life. If a person undertook only things in line with their abilities, they would almost always succeed. What causes their downfall is their self-esteem and ambition, which lead them off their path and confuse the desire to satisfy certain passions with a vocation. They fail, and it is their own fault. But instead of blaming themselves, they prefer to blame their star. Such a person would have been a good worker and earned an honest living, but they become a poor poet and die of hunger. There would be room for everyone if each person knew their place. 863. Do social customs not often force a person to follow one path rather than another, and are they not subject to the control of public opinion in choosing their occupations? Is this not what is called human respect, an obstacle to the exercise of free will? It is men who create social customs, not God. If they submit to them, it is because it suits them, and it remains an act of their free will, since they could not even free themselves from it. 863. So why complain? One should not blame social customs, but rather the senseless vanity that makes people prefer to die of hunger rather than turn away from them. No one considers this sacrifice to public opinion, while God will consider the sacrifice of their vanity. This does not mean that one should defy public opinion without reason, as some people do who have more originality than genuine philosophy. There is as much folly in seeking to be noticed, regarded as a curiosity, as there is wisdom in willingly and silently stepping down when one can no longer maintain the top of the ladder. 864. If there are people for whom luck seems to work against them, others appear to be favored as everything goes well for them. What is this due to? Often, it is because they know how to make the best of things, but it can also be a kind of test. Success intoxicates them. They rely on their fate, and often pay for these same successes with cruel setbacks that they could have avoided with prudence. 865. How can we explain the luck that favors some people in circumstances where neither will nor intelligence intervene, such as in games of chance, for example? Some spirits have chosen in advance certain types of pleasures. The luck that favors them is a temptation. One who wins as a man loses as a spirit. It is a test for their pride and greed. 866. The fatality that seems to preside over the material destinies of our lives remains an effect of our free will. You yourself chose your trial. The harder it is, the better you endure it, the higher you rise. Those who spend their lives in abundance and human happiness are cowardly spirits who remain stationary. Thus the number of the unhappy far exceeds that of the happy in this world, for most spirits seek the trial that will be most fruitful for them. They see too well the futility of their grandeur and enjoyment. Furthermore, the happiest life is always disturbed, always troubled, even if only by the absence of pain. 867. Where does the expression "born under a lucky star" come from? An ancient superstition that linked the stars to each man's destiny. An allegory that some are foolish enough to take literally, the knowledge of the future. 868. Can the future reveal itself to man? In principle, the future is hidden from him, and only in rare and exceptional cases does God allow it to be revealed. 869. For what purpose is the future hidden from man? If man knew the future, he would neglect the present and would not act with the same freedom, for he would be dominated by the idea that if something is meant to happen, he does not need to worry about it, or he would try to hinder it. God did not want it to be that way, so that everyone contributes to the realization of things, even those they would like to oppose. Thus, you often prepare unknowingly the events that will occur during your life. 870. If it is useful for the future to be hidden, why does God sometimes allow it to be revealed? It is when this prior knowledge must facilitate the realization of things rather than complicate it, by encouraging action different from what would have been done without it. Then it is often a test. The prospect of an event can awaken more or less good thoughts. For example, if a man knows he is going to receive an inheritance he did not expect, he may be tempted by greed, by the joy of increasing his earthly pleasures, or even desire the death of the person leaving him the fortune. Or this prospect may awaken good feelings and generous thoughts. If the prediction does not come true, it is another test. How will he endure the disappointment? But this does not detract from the merit or fault of the good or bad thoughts that belief in the event has aroused in him. 871. Since God knows everything, he also knows if a man will succumb or not to a trial. So what is the purpose of this trial, since it cannot teach God anything he does not already know about that man? It would be better to ask why God did not create a perfect and complete man, why man goes through childhood before reaching adulthood. The purpose of the trial is not to enlighten God about man's merit, for God knows perfectly well what he is worth, but it is to leave man fully responsible for his actions, for he is free to do them or not, as man can choose between good and evil. The effect of the trial is to place him before the temptation of evil and to let him earn all resistance. Even though God knows in advance whether he will succeed or not, he cannot judge, punish, or reward him for an act he has not committed. It is the same among men. No matter how capable an aspirant may be, no rank is conferred without examination, that is, without a trial. Similarly, a judge condemns a defendant solely based on an act committed and not on the prediction of that act. The more one reflects on the consequences that knowing the future could have for a man, the more one sees how wise Providence was to conceal it from him. The certainty of a happy event would plunge him into inaction, while the certainty of an unhappy event would plunge him into discouragement. In both cases, his strength would be paralyzed. Thus, the future appears to man as a goal to be reached through his own efforts without knowing the path to achieve it. Knowledge of all the incidents on the path would deprive him of his initiative and the use of his free will. He would be carried along by the fatal slope of events without exercising his faculties. When the success of something is assured, one ceases to be concerned about it. Theoretical summary of the motive of human actions, 872. The question of free will can be summarized as follows. Man is not inevitably led to evil. The acts he performs are not written in advance. The crimes he commits are not the result of a decree of fate. He can choose as a trial or atonement an existence where he will be driven to crime, whether by his environment or by the circumstances that arise. But he is always free to act or not to act. Thus, free will exists in the past of the spirit, in the choice of existence and trials, in the bodily state, in the ability to yield or resist the temptations to which we have voluntarily subjected ourselves. It is the role of education to combat these malevolent tendencies. It becomes useful when based on a thorough study of human moral nature through the knowledge of the laws governing that moral nature. It will be possible to modify it, just as intelligence is modified by education and temperament by hygiene. The spirit, when free from matter and in a wandering state, chooses its future bodily existences according to the degree of perfection it has attained. It is there, as we have said, that its free will primarily resides. This freedom is not annulled by incarnation. If it yields to the influence of matter, it is because it chooses the same trials, and it can invoke the assistance of God and good spirits to help it overcome them. Without free will, man finds neither evil in evil nor merit in good, and it is also recognized in the world that fault or praise is always proportional to the intention, that is, to the will. And where there is will, there is freedom. Therefore, man cannot seek an excuse for his misdeeds in his organization without renouncing his reason and his condition as a human being to assimilate himself to a brute. But when man does good, he tends not to attribute merit to himself, and he neglects to attribute it to his organs, which shows that he does not renounce instinctively, despite the opinion of some systematists. The most precious privilege of his species is the freedom to think. Fatality, as it is generally understood, implies the prior and irrevocable decision of all the events in life, however significant they may be. If this were the order of things, man would be a machine without will. And what would be the use of his intelligence if he were invariably dominated by the power of fate? Such a doctrine, if it were true, would imply the destruction of all moral freedom. There would be no responsibility for man, thus neither good nor evil, neither crimes nor virtues. God, who is supremely just, could not punish his creature for faults that were not dependent on it, nor reward it for virtues it did not earn. Such a law would also be the denial of the law of progress, for a being who expects everything from fate would make no effort to improve his condition. However, fatality is not a vain word. It resides in the position man occupies on earth and in the functions he performs there, depending on the type of existence his spirit has chosen as trial, atonement, or mission. He inevitably undergoes all the vicissitudes of this existence and all the good or bad tendencies inherent to it. But there ends the fatality, for it depends on his will to yield or not. These tendencies, the details of events, are subordinated to the circumstances that he himself provokes through his actions, and on which spirits can influence through the thoughts they suggest. Therefore, fatality resides in the events that occur as they are the consequence of the spirit's choice of existence. It cannot reside in the outcome of these events, as man can, through his prudence, alter their course. Fatality is never in the acts of moral life. It is in death that man is absolutely subject to the inexorable law of fatality, as he cannot escape the judgment that determines the end of his existence, nor the type of death that must interrupt his course. According to vulgar doctrine, man derives all his instincts from himself, either from his physical organization, for which he cannot be held responsible, or from his own nature, for which he may seek an excuse in his own eyes by saying that he is not responsible for being thus made. Spiritist doctrine is clearly more moral. It recognizes in man the full extent of free will. It tells him that if he does evil, it is because he succumbs to a bad external suggestion, leaving him entirely responsible, as it acknowledges his power of resistance, which is obviously easier if he must struggle against his own nature. Thus, according to Spiritist doctrine, there is no irresistible impulse. Man can always close his ear to the hidden voice that urges him to evil deep within his being, just as he can close his ear to someone who speaks to him materially. He can do this by his own will, by asking God for the necessary strength and seeking the assistance of good spirits for that purpose. This is what Jesus teaches us in the sublime prayer of the Our Father, when he has us say, "Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil." This theory of the exciting cause of our acts stems from all the teachings given by the spirits. Not only is it sublime in its morality, but we can add that it elevates man in his own eyes. It shows him free to shake off an oppressive yoke, just as he is free to close his house to intruders. He is no longer a machine acting on an impulse independent of his will, but a being of reason who listens, judges, and freely chooses between two pieces of advice. Moreover, despite this, man, deprived of his initiative, does not act less by his own initiative. Ultimately, he is nothing more than an incarnated spirit who retains under his bodily envelope the qualities and defects he had as a spirit. The faults we commit thus have their primary source in the imperfection of our own spirit, which has not yet attained the moral superiority it will one day achieve, but which still possesses its own free will. Corporeal life is given to him, so that he may purge himself of his imperfections through the trials he endures. It is precisely these imperfections that make him weaker and more accessible to the suggestions of other imperfect spirits who take advantage of this to try to make him succumb in the struggle he has undertaken. If he emerges victorious from this struggle, he rises. If he fails, he remains as he was, neither better nor worse. The more he purifies himself, the more he diminishes his weaknesses, and the less he is susceptible to those who solicit him for evil. His moral strength grows in proportion to his elevation, and evil spirits move away from him. All spirits, whether more or less good, contribute to humanity as long as they are incarnated. As our earth is one of the least advanced worlds, there are more evil spirits than good ones, which is why we see so much perversity here. So let us do everything we can to not return here after this stage, and to deserve to rest in a better world, one of those privileged worlds where pure goodness reigns, and where we will remember our time here only as a period of exile. Law of justice, love and charity, justice and natural rights property, rights, charity, and love for others, maternal and filial love. Is the sense of justice innate or the result of acquired ideas? It is so deeply rooted in nature that injustice revolts us. Moral progress undoubtedly develops this sense, but it does not create it. God placed it in the heart of man. That is why we often find among simple and primitive people notions of justice that are more accurate than those among those who possess much knowledge. If the law of justice is a law of nature, how is it that men understand it in such different ways, and that one finds what another considers unjust? Often passions are involved that alter this sense, like most other natural feelings, and cause one to view things from a distorted perspective. How can we define justice? Justice consists of respecting the rights of each person. These rights are determined by two things: human law and natural law. As humans have created laws in accordance with their morals and character, these laws have established rights that may have varied with the progress of enlightenment. Imagine if current laws, although not perfect, established the same rights as in the Middle Ages. Those archaic rights that seem monstrous to you would have seemed just and natural at that time. Thus, laws established by humans are not always aligned with justice. Moreover, they only regulate certain social relationships, whereas in private life and in a multitude of acts, it is the tribunal of conscience that has exclusive jurisdiction. Beyond the rights established by human law, what is the basis of justice founded on natural law? Christ told them to do to others what they would like to have done to them. God placed in the heart of man the rule of all true justice through the desire that everyone has to see their rights respected. When a man is unsure of what he should do towards his neighbor in a given circumstance, he should ask himself how he would like to be treated in the same situation. God could not give him a more certain guide than his own conscience. The criterion of true justice is indeed to desire for others what one desires for oneself, and to not desire for oneself what one would not want for others. Throughout history and in all beliefs, man has sought to assert his own rights. The greatness of the Christian religion has been to use personal rights as the basis for the rights of others. The necessity for man to live in society implies special obligations for him. The foremost of these is to respect the rights of his fellow beings. He who respects these rights will always be just. In your world, where so many men do not practice the law of justice, everyone seeks revenge, which makes your society confused and problematic. Social life grants rights and imposes reciprocal duties. If a man can be mistaken about the extent of his rights, how can he know their limits? The limit of rights is to recognize one's fellows in the same situation and vice versa. But if everyone claims the rights of others, what happens to the subordination to superiors? Does this not lead to the anarchy of all powers? Natural rights are the same for all men, from the smallest to the greatest. God did not make anyone purer than others from clay, and all are equal before him. These rights are eternal. Those established by man perish with his institutions. Moreover, everyone senses their own strength or weakness, and will always recognize a difference towards those who deserve it, through their virtue and wisdom. It is important to clarify this, so that those who consider themselves superior know their duties to deserve this difference. Subordination will not be compromised when authority is entrusted to wisdom. What would be the character of a man who practices justice in all its purity? The truly just, following the example of Jesus, would also practice love for others and charity, without which there is no true justice of property rights. What is the foremost of all natural rights of man? It is the right to live. Therefore, no one has the right to take the life of their fellow beings, nor to do anything that could endanger their physical existence. The right to life grants the right to accumulate food to rest when one can no longer work. But this should be done within the family, like the bee, through honest work, and not by selfish accumulation. Some animals provide examples of foresight. He has the right to defend what he has earned through his labor. God has said, "You shall not steal," and Jesus said, "Render unto Caesar what is Caesar's." What a man accumulates through work is legitimate property that he has the right to defend, as property earned through labor is a natural right as sacred as the right to work and to live. The desire to possess is in human nature, but when motivated by personal satisfaction, it is selfishness. It is not legitimate to desire to possess simply for the sake of possessing, as one who has enough to live does not constitute a burden to others. There are insatiable people who accumulate without benefit to anyone or to satisfy their passions. Do you think this is well seen by God? On the other hand, he who accumulates through his work to help his fellow beings practices the law of love and charity, and his work is blessed by God. What is the character of legitimate property? There is no legitimate property except that which has been acquired without harm to others. The law of love and justice forbids us from doing to others what we would not want done to ourselves, and thus condemns any means of acquisition contrary to this law. The right to property is indefinite, Undoubtedly, anything acquired legitimately is property. However, as we have said, human legislation, being imperfect, often establishes conventional rights that moral justice disapproves of. That is why laws are reformed as we progress and better understand justice. What seems perfect in one century appears as barbaric in the next. What is the true meaning of the word charity? As understood by Jesus, it is benevolence towards all, tolerance towards the imperfections of others, and forgiveness of offenses. Love and charity are the complements of the law of justice, for loving one's neighbor means doing all the good within our power for them, as we would like it to be done for us. This is the meaning of Jesus' words, love one another as brothers. Charity, according to Jesus, is not limited to almsgiving. It encompasses all the relationships we have with our fellow beings, whether they are our inferiors, equals, or superiors. It commands us to be indulgent, as we ourselves need indulgence. It forbids us from humiliating the unfortunate, contrary to what is often practiced. When a rich person presents themselves, we show them 1,000 courtesies and kindnesses. If they are poor, it seems that we don't need to concern ourselves with them. The more one feels compassion for someone's situation, the more one should fear exacerbating their misery by humiliating them. The truly good person seeks to uplift the inferior in their own eyes, thereby reducing the distance between them. Jesus also said, "Love even your enemies." Is loving our enemies not contrary to our natural inclinations? And does enmity not stem from a lack of sympathy between spirits? Loving enemies means forgiving them and returning good for evil. In this way, one becomes superior to them. With vengeance, one places oneself below them. Regarding almsgiving, a person reduced to begging becomes morally and physically degraded. They are dehumanized in a society based on God's law and justice. The life of the weak must be assisted without humiliation. We should take care of those who cannot work without leaving their lives to chance and goodwill. Do not blame almsgiving itself. What is often blameworthy is the way it is done. The good person who understands charity according to Jesus goes to meet the unfortunate without waiting for them to extend their hand. True charity is always good and benevolent, both in manner and in action. A service rendered with delicacy doubles its value. If done with arrogance, necessity may make it acceptable, but the heart is little touched. Also remember that ostentation removes the merit of a good deed in the eyes of God. Jesus said, "Let your left hand not know what your right hand is doing." Thus, he teaches us not to taint charity with pride. One must distinguish between almsgiving proper and charity. The most needy is not always the one who asks. The fear of humiliation keeps the truly poor away, and often they suffer in silence. It is this person, truly human, who knows how to seek without ostentation. Love one another is the whole law, the divine law by which God governs the worlds. Love is the law of attraction for living and organized beings. Attraction is the law of love for inorganic matter. Never forget that a spirit, regardless of its degree of progression, its reincarnation situation, or its wandering state, is always placed between a superior who guides and perfects it, and an inferior towards whom it has the same duties to fulfill. Therefore be charitable, not only with the charity that consists of taking money from one's purse and coldly giving it to someone who dares to ask, but be attentive to hidden miseries. Be indulgent towards the faults of your fellow beings, rather than despising ignorance and vice by instructing and moralizing them. Be gentle and kind with all that is inferior to you, just as with the lowest beings in creation. In this way, you will have obeyed the law of God, St. Vincent de Paul. There are no people reduced to begging by their own fault without a doubt. But a good moral education could have taught them to practice the law of God, and they would not have fallen into the excesses that caused their downfall. This is primarily what depends on the improvement of your world. Maternal and filial love. Is maternal love a virtue or an instinctive feeling common to humans and animals? It is both. Nature has given the mother love for her children in the interest of their preservation, but in animals, this love is limited to material needs and is used when the young become useless. In humans, this love persists throughout life and involves devotion and sacrifice, which are virtues. It even survives death and follows the child beyond the grave, clearly showing that there is something more in it than in animals. Since maternal love is natural, why are there mothers who hate their children, sometimes from birth? It is sometimes a trial chosen by the child's spirit, or an atonement if they were a bad parent or child in a previous existence. In all cases, the bad mother can only be driven by a bad spirit that strives to make the child's spirit fail in the trial it has chosen. But this violation of the laws of nature will not go unpunished. The child's spirit will be rewarded for the obstacles it has overcome. When parents have children who cause them pain, they are not excused for not having the tenderness they would have had under other circumstances. They are entrusted with these charges, and their mission is to do everything to guide them towards good. But these pains are often the result of the wrong path they allowed their children to take from birth. They thus reap what they have sown. What is the most meritorious of all virtues? All virtues have their merit because they are all signs of progress on the path of good. There is virtue whenever there is voluntary resistance to the impulse of bad inclinations. But the most sublime of virtues resides in the sacrifice of personal interest for the good of others, without ulterior motive. What is most meritorious is that which is rooted in the most disinterested charity. There are people who do good spontaneously without having to overcome contrary feelings. They are as deserving as those who must struggle against their own nature and surpass it. Those who do not have to struggle have progressed. They have fought in the past and triumphed. That is why good feelings come effortlessly to them, and their actions seem simple. Kindness has become a habit for them, and thus they should be honored like old warriors who have earned their stripes. Although they are still far from perfection, these examples surprise them with their contrast, and they admire them all the more because they are rarer. But one must know that in more advanced worlds than this one, what is an exception in your case is the rule. The feeling of kindness is spontaneous everywhere, as these worlds are inhabited only by good spirits, and a single bad intention would be a monstrous exception. That is why people there are happy. Earth will be so as well when humanity transforms and understands and practices charity in its true sense. Aside from the defects and vices that no one can confuse, what is the most characteristic sign of imperfection? It is self-interest. Moral qualities are often like gold opposed to a brass object that does not withstand the touchstone. A person may possess true qualities that make them appear to be a good person in the eyes of the world. But these qualities, though a step forward, do not always withstand certain tests. Sometimes it is enough to touch the string of self-interest to expose one's true nature. True disinterestedness is so rare on earth that it is admired as a phenomenon when it occurs. Attachment to material goods is a notorious sign of inferiority, as the more a person clings to them, the less they understand their destiny. In contrast, disinterestedness demonstrates that one sees the future from a higher perspective. It is blameworthy to do good not for the sake of a reward on earth, but with the hope that it will be counted in the afterlife and that one's position there will be all the better. This mindset harms one's own progress. We must do good out of charity, that is, out of disinterestedness. However, each of us has a very natural desire to progress from the painful state of this life. The same spirits teach us to practice good with this goal. It is therefore mistaken to think that by doing good, we might hope for something better than on earth. No, certainly not. But the one who does good without ulterior motives and for the simple pleasure of being pleasing to God and to others demonstrates a certain progress that will allow them to achieve happiness much sooner than their more positive counterpart. Do good for reason, not driven by the natural warmth of your heart. There should be no distinction here between the good one can still do for others and the effort one makes to correct one's own faults. We understand that doing good with the thought that it will be considered in the afterlife is not very meritorious, but correcting oneself, overcoming passions, and rectifying one's character to approach good spirits and elevate oneself is also a sign of inferiority. No, by doing good, we do not mean being creative. The one who calculates what each good action might bring them in the future life, as well as on earth, acts selfishly. But there is no selfishness in improving oneself with the goal of drawing closer to God, as that is the goal all should aim for. Since bodily life is only a temporary stay here on earth, and our future should be our main concern, it is useful to strive to acquire scientific knowledge that pertains only to things and material needs. Between incarnations, you will learn in an hour what would take years on your earth. No knowledge is useless. All contribute, to a greater or lesser extent, to the advancement of the spirit, for the perfect spirit must know everything, and as progress must be achieved in all directions, all acquired ideas help in the development of the spirit. Of two rich men, one was born in opulence and has never known need, while the other owes his fortune to his labor. Both use it exclusively for their own satisfaction. Which is more blameworthy? The one who has known suffering understands what it is to suffer. He knows the pain that is not alleviated, although he too often forgets it. The one who continually accumulates and does no good to anyone finds a valid excuse in the idea that he is amassing to leave more to his heirs. This is a compromise with a guilty conscience. 901. Two stingy men. The first denies himself life's necessities and dies of want while sitting on his treasure. The second is stingy with himself, but generous toward others. He avoids any sacrifice to help or do something useful. It costs him nothing to indulge his tastes and passions. When asked to perform a service, he always has excuses. When acting for himself, he always has enough. Who is more blameworthy, and who will have the worst place in the spirit world? The one who enjoys himself is more selfish than stingy. The other has already received part of his punishment. 902. It is wrong to envy wealth when it is driven by a desire to do good. The sentiment is commendable when it is pure, but is this desire always disinterested and free from hidden personal motives? Is not the first person to whom we wish to do good often ourselves? 903. Are we guilty of studying the faults of others? If it is to criticize and expose them, it is very blameworthy, as it lacks charity. If it is to benefit personally and avoid those faults ourselves, it can sometimes be useful, but one should not forget that indulgence toward others' faults is one of the virtues of charity. Before reproaching others for their imperfections with evidence, examine yourself. Therefore, strive to have qualities opposite to the faults you criticize in others. Thus, you will be superior. If you reproach stinginess, be generous. If you reproach pride, be humble and modest. If you reproach harshness, be kind. If you act pettishly, be great in all your actions. In a word, make sure that no one can tell you what Jesus said. Why do you see the speck in your brother's eye, but do not notice the log in your own eye? 904. Are we guilty of probing the wounds of society and exposing them? It depends on the sentiment that leads to it. If the writer aims only to provoke scandal for their own pleasure by presenting images that are often more harmful than good examples, the spirit may relish it, but could be punished for this pleasure in revealing evil. In this case, we can judge the purity of intentions and the sincerity of the writer. It is not always useful. If they write good things, benefit from them. If they write bad things, it is a matter of conscience that concerns them. Moreover, if they want to prove their sincerity, they must support the precept with their own example. 905. Some authors have published very beautiful and moral works that contribute to the progress of humanity, but of which they themselves have barely benefited. They should be regarded as good spirits for the works they have created. Morality without action is like seeds without cultivation. What use is the seed if it is not made to bear fruit for nourishment? These men are more blameworthy because they had the intelligence to understand, but did not practice the maxims they taught, thus renouncing the harvest of fruits. 906. It is wrong for a person who performs good deeds to be aware of and recognize them in themselves, as they may also be aware of the evil they do. They must be aware of the good to know if they are acting well or poorly, by weighing all their actions against the law of God, and especially the laws of justice, love, and charity. They can thus judge whether their actions are good or bad, and approve or disapprove of them. It is therefore only wrong if they recognize that they have triumphed over bad tendencies and are satisfied with it. as long as they do not derive pride from it, for then they would fall into another fault. 907. Given that the principle of passions resides in nature, it is not inherently wrong to have passions. It is the excess related to the will that is wrong, as the principle was given to man for good and can lead to the accomplishment of great things. It is the abuse of passions that causes harm. 908. How do we define the limit where passions cease to be good or bad? Passions are like a useful horse when controlled and dangerous when uncontrolled. Thus, a passion becomes harmful when one ceases to master it and it causes harm to oneself or others. Passions are levers that multiply man's strength tenfold and help him realize the designs of providence. But if man lets them direct him instead of directing them, excesses occur and the same strength that could be beneficial turns against him and crushes him. All passions have their origin in a sense of necessity or nature. Thus, the principle of passions is not evil in itself, as it rests on one of the providential conditions of our existence. Passion, strictly speaking, is the exaggeration of a need or feeling. It resides in the excess, not in the cause, and this excess becomes evil when it causes any form of harm. Any passion that brings man closer to animal nature distances him from spiritual nature. Any feeling that elevates man above his animal nature signals the predominance of spirit over matter and brings him closer to perfection. 909. Can man always overcome his bad inclinations by his own efforts? Yes, but sometimes his efforts are weak. What is lacking is willpower. How few are those who make this effort? 9 and 10. Can man find effective help from the spirits to overcome his passions? If he sincerely prays to God and his good spirit, the good spirits will certainly come to his aid, as that is their mission. 911. There are no passions so strong and irresistible that the will is powerless to overcome them. Many people say, "I want," but the will is only on their lips. They want and are quite content that it is not so. When one believes they cannot overcome their passions, it is because the spirit consents to them due to its inferiority. One who seeks to repress them understands their spiritual nature. Conquering them is a triumph of the spirit over matter. 912. What is the most effective way to combat the dominance of bodily nature? Self-denial, selfishness. 913. What vice can be considered radical? We have said it many times, it is selfishness. From it derives all evil. Study all the vices, and you will see that at the core of each one lies selfishness. Whatever you do against them, you will not succeed in eradicating them until you have attacked the evil at the root, until you have destroyed the cause. Direct all your efforts toward this goal, for it is the true plague of society. Anyone who wishes to approach moral perfection in this life must extirpate all selfishness from their heart, for it is incompatible with justice, love, and charity. It neutralizes all other qualities. 914. Since selfishness is based on a sense of personal interest, it seems very difficult to completely extirpate it from the human heart. Is it possible, while people are learning about spiritual things, valuing material things less, and thus reforming human institutions that support and excite it? It depends on education. 915. Since selfishness is inherent to the human race, will it not always be an obstacle to the reign of absolute good on earth? Certainly, selfishness is its greatest evil, but this is due to the inferiority of incarnated spirits on earth, not to humanity itself. Spirits, by purifying themselves through successive incarnations, lose their selfishness as they lose their other impurities. There is no man on earth who is free of selfishness and practices charity, but there are more than you think, for virtue does not seek the spotlight. If there is one, why should there not be 10? If there are 10, why should there not be 1,000? And so on. 6. Selfishness, far from diminishing, grows with civilization, which seems to excite and support it as best it can. The cause must destroy the effect. The greater the evil, the more frightening selfishness becomes. It has taken much harm for people to understand the need to eradicate it. When men have shed the selfishness that dominates them, they will live as brothers, not harming each other, but helping each other through a sense of solidarity. Then the strong will be a support, and not an oppressor of the weak, and no one will lack what they need to live, as all will practice the law of justice. This is the reign of good that the spirits strive to prepare. 9-17. What is the most difficult way to destroy selfishness, the most challenging of all human imperfections? Selfishness is difficult to eradicate because it is due to the influence of matter, from which man, still too close to his origins, has not been able to free himself. This influence is maintained by all its laws, social organization, and education. Selfishness will weaken with the predominance of moral life over material life, and especially with the understanding that Spiritism provides of the future state, real and not distorted by allegories. Selfishness is based on the importance of personality, but well-understood Spiritism, I repeat, does not make personality disappear by seeing it from such a high level before the immensity, thus destroying its importance, or at least making it appear for what it is. It necessarily combats selfishness, as man's resentment towards others' selfishness often makes him selfish himself, because he feels the need to defend himself when seeing others thinking of themselves and not of him. He is therefore compelled to be more concerned with himself than with others. Let the principle of charity and fraternity be the basis of social institutions, legal relations from people to people and from man to man, and man will think less of himself when he sees that others have thought of him. He will be influenced by the moralizing power of example and contact. In the face of this overflow of selfishness, true virtue is required to deny one's own personality for the benefit of others who do not know gratitude. That is why it is especially those who possess this virtue to whom the kingdom of heaven is open, and to them is reserved the happiness of the elect. For I tell you the truth, that on the day of judgment, those who have thought only of themselves will be rejected and will suffer from their negligence. It is a real evil affecting everyone, of which everyone is more or less a victim. Therefore, it must be fought as one fights an epidemic disease. For this, we must proceed as doctors do, seek out all the aspects of social organization, from the family to the villages, from the farm to the palace, all the causes, all the evident or hidden influences that excite, maintain, and develop the sense of selfishness. Once the causes are known, the remedy will present itself. It will involve not only combating them, but at least partially and progressively, the poison will be extirpated. Healing may take a long time because the causes are numerous, but it is not impossible. It can only be achieved by uprooting the evil at the root, that is, through education. Not an education aimed at forming educated men, but at forming good men. Properly understood education is the key to moral progress. When we know how to mold character, as we know how to mold intellect, we will be able to correct one as we correct young plants. But this art requires a lot of tact, experience, and deep observation. It is a serious mistake to believe that science alone is sufficient to apply it fruitfully. Whoever observes the child of a wealthy person, as well as that of a poor person from birth, will see all the pernicious influences affecting them due to the weakness, negligence, and ignorance of those who guide them. And when the means used to moralize them are often misguided, we should not be surprised to find so many deviations in the world. Let us do as much for morality as we do for intellect, and we will see that there are resistant natures, more numerous than we believe, that only need to be well cultivated to produce beautiful fruits. Man wants to be happy. This feeling is in his nature. That is why he works tirelessly to improve his condition on earth. He seeks the causes of his suffering to remedy them. When he understands that selfishness is one of these causes, the one that generates pride, ambition, greed, envy, hatred, jealousy, that constantly torment him, that causes his problems in all social relations, that provokes dissension, destroys trust, forces him to be constantly defensive towards others, and ultimately transforms a friend into an enemy. He will also understand that this vice is incompatible with his own happiness. The more he has suffered from it, the more he will feel the need to fight it like one fights plague, harmful animals, and other scourges. He will be driven by his own interest. Selfishness is the source of all vices, just as charity is the source of all virtues. Destroying one and developing the other should be the objective of all human efforts if one wishes to ensure their happiness, both here and in the future. Characteristics of a good person. By what sign can we recognize that a person has made true progress that will elevate their spirit in the Spiritist hierarchy? The spirit shows its elevation when all the acts of its bodily life are the practice of God's law and when it anticipates the spiritual life. The true good person is one who practices the law of justice, love, and charity in its greatest purity. If their conscience questions them about their actions, they will ask if they have violated this law, if they have done any harm, if they have done all the good they could without anyone complaining, if they have done for others everything they would have wanted done for themselves. A person imbued with the feeling of charity and love for others does good for the sake of doing good, without hope of return, and sacrifices their own interest for justice. They are kind, humane, and amiable with everyone, seeing brothers in all men, without exception of race or belief. If God has given them power and wealth, they see these things as a trust they must use for good without pride, for they know that the God who gave them can also take them away. If the social order has placed men under their dependence, they treat them with kindness and benevolence because they are their equals before God. They use their authority to uplift morality, not to crush others with their pride. They are indulgent toward the weaknesses of others, because they know they themselves need indulgence. Remembering Christ's words, "Let him who is without sin cast the first stone," they are not vindictive, following Jesus' example, forgiving offenses, and only remembering the good actions they have done, knowing they will be forgiven as they have forgiven others. Finally, they respect their fellow beings, all the rights granted by the law of nature, as they would like those rights to be respected towards themselves, being self-aware. What is the most practical and effective way to improve in this life and resist the impulse of evil? An ancient sage told you, "Know thyself." We understand the wisdom of this maxim, but the difficulty lies precisely in knowing oneself. How can one achieve it? At the end of the day, I performed a self-examination, reviewed what I had done, and asked myself if I had failed in any duty, if anyone had complained about me. This is how I learned to know myself and see what I needed to reform in me. One who each evening recalls all their actions of the day and asks what they have done well or badly, praying to God and their guardian angel to enlighten them, gains great strength to improve themselves. For believe me, God will help them. Ask yourself, what have you done and for what purpose did you act in such and such circumstances? Have you done something you would reproach others for? Have you done something you would not dare to admit? Ask yourself this question again. If God were to call me at this moment, would I have to fear returning to the world of spirits where nothing is hidden from anyone? Examine what you might have done against God, then against your neighbor, and finally, against yourself. The answers are either a relief to your conscience or an indication of a wrong that needs to be corrected. Self-knowledge is thus the key to personal improvement. But you may ask, how can we judge ourselves? We do not have the illusion of self-love that diminishes faults and makes them excusable. The miser simply believes they are thrifty and prudent. The proud person simply believes they have dignity. This is very clear, but you have a means of control that cannot deceive you. When you are unsure of the value of one of your actions, ask yourself how you would judge it if someone else did it. If the fault lies with the other person, it cannot be more legitimate in yourself, as God does not have two standards for justice. Also seek to know what others think, and do not disregard the opinion of your enemies, as they have no interest in distorting the truth, and often God places them by your side as a mirror to warn you more frankly than a friend might. Those who sincerely wish to improve themselves should explore their conscience to uproot bad inclinations, as they would pull weeds from their garden. They should weigh their moral day as a merchant weighs their losses and gains, and I assure you that one will bring more benefit than the other. If you can say to yourself that your day was good, you can sleep in peace and await the awakening in another life without fear. Ask yourself clear and precise questions, and do not be afraid to multiply them. One can dedicate a few minutes to achieve eternal happiness. Do you not work every day to accumulate enough to provide yourself with rest in your old age? Is not this rest the object of all your desires, the goal that makes you endure momentary fatigue and deprivation? So, what is this rest of a few days disrupted by bodily illnesses compared to the rest that awaits the good person? It is not worth comparing. I know that many say that the present is certain and the future uncertain, but it is precisely this thought that we are here to dispel in you. We want you to understand this future in such a way that there is no uncertainty left in your soul. That is why we first attracted your attention with phenomena that strike your senses, and then we provide you with instructions that each of you is tasked with spreading. This is how we dictated the Book of Spirits. And indeed, following St. Augustine's advice, if we frequently interrogate our conscience, we would see how many times we have failed without realizing it, simply because we have not examined the nature and motive of our actions. This requires categorical answers of yes or no, leaving no alternative. These are all personal arguments, and by summing up the responses, we can conjecture the total amount of good and evil within us.